What?
Okay, now I'm going to share my screen. And first one, share. Okay.
And Beta Beta, I have your ARTID now, and Gene, I have yours as well. And Megan, I'm going to put the textbooks for Professor Powers in the chat. Okay.
Okay, so again, we're going to be doing 4 PowerPoints. Topics are going to include intrinsic tissue and intrinsic scan parameters. That's going to be the first one. Then we're going to hit extrinsic scan parameters and pulse sequences and artifacts. So 4 of them. Going to mix in MRI math. I initially was just going to do a section just on math, but I decided to mix it all in as we went along. So without further ado, all right, so just to give you a little bit of background on how we're going to do this, like I said, 2 sessions. 1 and 2, we'll take a break. 3 and 4, and we'll finish up. Please ask questions if you've got them. I'll answer them as posted, or if I'm too busy chirping away and I haven't answered your question, please unmute your mic and give me a shout, okay? There's a 20-question practice test that's being offered. You can get it by a separate link. Again, I thank you for your time and attention. And I got asked multiple times the last time. I do not have printable versions of this course that are available, just so you know. So I do not have printable versions. All right, so a little bit about myself. I've got 40 years of radiology experience. 30 of those happen to be in MRI. The first 10 were in CAT scan and special procedures. I've got 14 years teaching experience at a local community college near my home. 5 years as an application specialist with GE Healthcare. I'm one of the instructors for Pulse Radiology, and I also lecture for a private CEU company called Advanced Health. They are out of Houston, Texas. As Neil said, I'm the author of 2 separate books, MRI Tech-to-Tech Explanations and Registry Review, Tech-to-Tech Questions and Answers. If you are interested in those, they are both available through either Barnes & Noble or Amazon, or directly through Wiley Blackwell Publishing out of London, England. So without further ado, we'll keep on going. So intrinsic scan parameters or intrinsic tissue characteristics are the T1, T2 relaxation properties, as well as proton density. And I'll go into those a little bit. Then in the same PowerPoint, intrinsic scan parameters. So don't let intrinsic confuse you. So you've got intrinsic tissue parameters, which means it's what the tissues do. MRIs make noise and babies cry. It's what they do. All right. So those are characteristics. The intrinsic scan parameters, TRTE, echo train, TI, and flip angle. After I get done doing those, I'll go into what I call my image contrast and weighting triangles. It's something I kind of developed during my time at GE. I kind of figured this out. Then we'll do the geometric properties, the geometric parameters. I'll hit most of the major pulse sequences. I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing spectroscopy or dynamic susceptibility of contrast stuff, because I highly doubt the registry is going to be asking you those. And then we're going to finish up just when you guys are ready to hear me be quiet. I'm going to talk about artifacts. All right. So right off the bat, we got inherent tissue parameters. The first one is T1 contrast. That's what I'm going to get into. So every tissue has its own T1, T2 relaxation time and a unique proton density. Now, proton density is what everybody uses nowadays. That's the modern term, I guess you'd say. But however, when I was a kid learning MR a while back, it was called spin density. Started to become proton density at that time, but it's also known as hydrogen density. So any of those 3 terms are equally applicable, okay? So if they're asking you a proton density question, they might kind of shroud that by calling it, well, hydrogen density is such and such. You have to know the different terms. Just like T1 is called spin lattice, and T2 is called spin-spin. You have to know those terms reversibly. You have to know them because they love to use these oblique terms for the same thing, okay? So T1 time of a tissue is how long it takes for 63% of the net magnetization vector to recover. You've got to know that definition. T1, 63% is gone back to align back with B0. You've got to know that. I'll bet you a cup of coffee they're going to ask you that. You're going to see something about that. And I'll bet you another cup of coffee, they're probably going to throw in the term spin lattice at you somewhere. T1, spin lattice, T1, they're the same, tomatoes, tomatoes. So in MRI, this is how I like to teach it. In MRI, we knock them down, meaning we knock down the net magnetization vector from being aligned with B0, we knock it into the transverse plane with an RF pulse. So knock them down. And then what are they going to do? They're not staying in the transverse plane. They want to go back to where they just were. That is standing up. So we knock them down and let them stand up. They T1. So in the top right-hand corner, you're going to see this little movie. And if you watch it real quick, there an RF pulse is applied. They get knocked down into the transverse plane. And over time, that pink arrow is growing bigger and bigger. The vector is getting larger and larger, returning to the B0. Okay. And that's the T1 relaxation. Okay. So watch it real quick. You hit it with the RF, refocus it. Don't worry about that right now. And at T1s, it's going into that large red circle, T1 going on right there. That's the 63% of the net magnetization vector. That's T1 relaxation. Know that there are multiple tissues that we're going to be imaging, but for the most part, we're going to be imaging fat and water because in MRI, we follow the water. You've heard the expression follow the money. In MRI, we're following the water. The body's reaction to any kind of insult, be it infection, tumor, surgery, radiation therapy, is to force water to that area. So we're going to be imaging the water. Know that water has a long T1 and a long T2, as opposed to fat, which has a short T1 and T2. So fat, GAD, and proteins are fast to T1, and water and edema are slow to T1. Now we've got T2 relaxation, okay? That is the time for the net magnetization vector to decay. It's a decay process. It's going to lower itself to 37% of its original value. So 37, guys. So if you notice, you go, wait a minute. T1 is 63 and T2 is 37. How convenient. That adds up to 100. So if you memorize one, the other is true. So T1 grows to 63, T2 decays to 37. Memorize one and the opposite is true. So a tissue's T2 time, just so you know, is always shorter than its T1 time, always. Okay, so again, we knock them down with an RF, we let them dephase, they spread out. That's what happens. That big, large red circle, after we hit them with an RF, they decay. It spreads out in the transverse plane and then eventually goes back to B0. So T1 and T2 relaxation happen simultaneously, but they are independent of each other, okay? Got some chats here. Okay, that's just Neil. That's just Neil giving me kudos. Thank you, Neil. Okay, so remember, T1 and T2 simultaneous, T1 and T2 independent of each other. T2, another way of describing it, it's loss of phase coherence. Okay, so when they're in the transverse plane and they're all together, when they start to spread out in the transverse plane, that is loss of phase coherence. They're in phase here all together, and then they get out of phase. And just so you know, these are chopsticks, spray painted yellow for fat and blue for water. I'm probably going to be using those again at some point in time. Okay, so T1 and T2 curves. You guys are probably familiar with these, and that's excellent. I want you to be familiar with these. Let's make that go away. That's good. All right, so T1 curve on the left depicts the amount of relaxation occurring from two different tissues. So T1 is a regrowth process. So the vectors start at 0 over on the bottom left, and over time, everybody will T1 relax, some faster, some slower. So in that particular T1 relaxation curve, white matter depicted by red is faster than the CSF depicted by, well, I don't know if that's gray or blue, but however, you've got T1 contrast, T1 relaxation differences. Over time, the CSF is going to catch up with the water, and they'll have equal amounts of relaxation. Now, T2 is on the right-hand side. That depicts the protons leaving the transverse plane and going back to B0. The distance in between, and here's what a lot of books and articles don't tell you that, but the distance in between those two lines, that's contrast. So I'm gonna show you a little bit better example of that. So the distance in between those lines is contrast. As those lines get closer together, your contrast is decreasing. Okay, so here's the T1 curve, and it's just what I just said. At number 1 that I have circled in red, that's good T1 contrast. Your TR is short enough that you can see that T1 contrast. If you use a TR that's too long and you start getting over towards the number 2 that's circled, what kind of contrast have you got? Not much, because they both equally relax the same amount. Also remember that tissues need to T1 relax in order to give you signal. If you start with a TR that's too short, then nothing's relaxed and your signal is grainy and it's low signal to noise. So position number 2, like I said, is little to no T1 contrast, because down the bottom of that graph, you can see the TR is getting longer and longer. And what happens is you lose T1 contrast. Same thing here. This is a T2 curve. One thing you might have noticed is that a T1 curve is basically the same thing as a T2 curve, just flipped upside down. So tissues start to T2 relax, and at some point you've got good contrast between the tissues. One's bright and one's dark. And that's what contrast is, ladies and gentlemen. One's bright, one's dark, you have contrast. If you let your TE get too long over by position number 2, then probably the only thing that's giving you any kind of signal is water, and you've got no contrast. Everything else is dark, very, very dark. Okay, and now we're going to hit proton density. So proton density is not any kind of process. It's a tissue characteristic. They love to say, what is proton density? And they'll give you the options. It's a tissue characteristic. Some tissues have a lot of protons in them, like water, and some tissues don't have as many protons in them, fat. So if you were to get signal from one tissue versus another, you've got a difference in proton density. You've got a difference in signal intensity. Okay, so the arrow in that top right image shows CSF is bright in the ventricles because it has a high proton density. And the periventricular white matter is not as bright. It's still got some signal to it, but not as much, because the white matter has a lesser proton density. So you're going to have to identify curves. I'll bet you a cup of coffee, you're going to have to identify a curve. They'll put up a graph and they'll say, what kind of curve is this? And hopefully you're going to say, those lines are going up. So that's a regrowth process. That's a T1 weighted, or that's a T1 relaxation curve. Excellent. They'll show you a T2 and they'll say, what kind of curve is this? And you say, that's relaxation because the lines are down going. Just so you know, there's no such thing as a proton density curve. If there is, I don't know about it. So when they give you your choices or your possible answers, one or two are probably pretty close. Two of them are not. So whittle it down and say, all right, I'm not sure about this one, but I know this one's wrong and that one's wrong. And now if you have to guess, it's a 50-50. Okay, so now we're done with intrinsic tissue parameters. Now we're going to jump forward to intrinsic scan parameters. Those intrinsic scan parameters, the biggies are TR, TE, flip angle, echo train, and TI. So remember, the old rule in MRI, and it's been around since I started 30 years ago, TR controls T1, TE controls T2, and we're going to cover mostly TR and TE right now, and then we'll jump forward to flip angle and echo train. So what's the definition of TR? Again, if it's in red, I'll bet you lunch this time that you're going to see what the definition of TR is. So it's the time in milliseconds from the first 90 to the next 90. And here's the key words here that excite the same slice. So the way I teach it is I like to describe TR as a loop around time. You hit the first slice and then you're going to go on to 2, 3, 4, 5 and out to 20. And then you're going to come back to the first slice again. That's one TR period, whether it's 500 milliseconds or 5,000 milliseconds. It's a loop around time. So it's how long before the scanner repeats itself over and over again, because that's what a pulse sequence is. It's a very rigidly timed sequence of events, and you just keep on coming back to slice one again. So if you hear a TR question, you see a TR question, it's often aimed at a T1 answer. Okay. So long TRs versus short TRs. So a long TR is going to mean that both long and short relaxing tissue, for example, CSF or edema, it's been knocked down and you've let it stand up. And it will be able to give you signal at TE. So for example, in a proton density, long TR and a short TE, they're both going to be able to give you signal. So in MRI, our signals are mixed. We can see signal from any one of those tissues, depending on whether we use a short TR or a long TR or a short TE. So for example, short TR is going to allow only short relaxing tissues to be able to stand up. So remember, tissue needs to T1 relax to be ready to go for the next TR. So a short TR means that short relaxing tissues have been knocked down and they've been able to stand up and can contribute signal at TE. They will be bright. There's more of those short T1 relaxing tissues in the transverse plane at TE than the long ones. So examples of short T1 tissues I've already given you. Fat Gadden protein, those are the three biggies. FGP, fat Gadden protein. Long T1 relaxing tissues, water, AKA edema, CSF, and actually urine, because those are both mostly water. So if you want to think about TR, it's a T1 relaxation filter. Short TRs only give enough time for short T1 tissue to relax so that they can be bright. So with a short TR, we're excluding long T1 relaxing tissues, which is water and edema. Remember, we're following the water, guys. So here's an example, a visual description or a visual of what TR is. It's the time from the 90 to the next 90 that excites the same slice. Notice that the two 90s with the arrow, they're the same color, so they're the same slice. So TR controls T1 contrast. And for all different scanners, there's different TRs that work best for T1. we have to find a balance between having a good T1 contrast, but we also have to have good signal to noise. If we go too short with our TR, we're going to lose signal to noise. So you want to be in the sweet spot or the Goldilocks zone. And that's what this image shows you right here. So top right, that is right out of my book. And it shows that if you image with too short of a TR, number one, over to the left, that image is kind of grainy because we're not giving enough time for tissue to T1 relax. Then not enough of them are in the transverse plane to give signal. Then in the middle, number two, that's the Goldilocks zone. You notice we got good gray and white matter differentiation. We've got good signal to noise. Now we're in the Goldilocks zone. But if your TR goes too high, for example, 800 TR, we're over where those lines are much closer together and we've lost T1 contrast. So here's an example of a couple of questions that they might ask you. So in a spin echo sequence, short TRs will make the images what? So take a look at your answers. Take a second. Okay. They could also ask you basically the same question, but just the other way around. In a spin echo sequence, long TRs make an image what? Okay, so now for the answer to the first one, spin echo pulse sequences, short TRs will make your images more what? They're going to be more T1. Remember, TR controls T1. In a spin echo, long TRs make your image what? Okay, remember, I said earlier, a TR question is probably pointing towards a T1 answer. TR questions, T1 answers. Okay, in a spin echo, long TRs make an image what? Less T1. Some of you might have said, oh, a long TR. Oh, I need a long TR for T2. Yes, you do. But the long TR just means less T1 contrast. Okay, so T2 relaxation, it's the other kind of relaxation. So when we knock the protons down with the RF, the protons don't just magically stand back up. They start to spread out or fan out like a fan. That's loss of phase coherence. So the top picture is taken, for example, and that's, you might think I have a thing for chopsticks, but they work very well. So the top image there is a bunch of chopsticks all piled up on each other, and they're all together. They're all in phase. Over time, though, they start to spread out. They're starting to lose phase, or what we call T2 relaxation. The longer the TE, the more spreading out you get, and the brighter fluid's going to be, because guess what? Remember, the longer the TE, we're going to let fat get out of the way. Fat is short to T1, short to T2. So a long TE is going to let fat basically get out of the way, which is going to leave water to be giving the majority of signal at TE. So fat will be a little darker. Water is going to be a bunch brighter with a long TE. So T2, another name is loss of phase coherence. You've got to know the definition of your TE. It's the time from the center of the echo to the center of the excitation pulse. Okay, so from the 90, center of the 90 to the center of the echo. So when you hear TE, now think T2. So again, if you get a TE question, think it's a T2 answer, or vice versa. A T2 question, you should start shading yourself towards, ooh, T2 question is probably a TE answer of some sort. So what about a TE question? In a spin echo pulse sequence, shorter TEs will make your images what? Short TEs are going to make them what? Spin echo pulse sequence, long TEs are going to make your image what? Again, this is basically the same question, just wanting to know if you know what short and long TEs do to your image contrast. So the first answer is a short TE is going to make your image not more T1, it's going to make it less T2. You're putting less T2 contrast into the image. And spin echo pulse sequence, long TEs, make your image what? Again, more T2. Long, as soon as you hear long TE, you stop thinking T2. Okay, here's another example of where they might try to trip you up and use a different name for the same thing. How many of you guys knew that the word TE, another name for it is 2 tau? You don't have to raise your hand, that's fine. Okay, but that's an older name for it, 2 tau. The time from the 90 to the 180 is 1 tau. The time from the 180 to the echo is 1 tau. So 1 plus 1 equals 2 tau. So if they say, oh, if you use a long 2 tau, that means a long TE. So just so you know, that's what 2 tau means. It's another name for TE. They could ask you a question something like, if your TE is 90 milliseconds, when is your 180-degree refocusing pulse applied? Well, if 1 tau and 1 tau equals TE, so your 180 is applied at half your TE. The answer to that question would be 45 milliseconds. Half of 90 is 45. So that's another quick little easy math that they could ask you. All right, now echo train length. So an echo train, when you hear echo train, you start thinking, all right, fast or turbo spin echo. They might say to you, if your echo train is increased from 2 to 4, what's going to happen to your scan time? Well, you've just doubled your echo train, so you're going to half your scan time. So scan time is cut by a factor of the echo train. That's nice and easy. So the echo train, or fast spin echo, excuse me, is a spin echo with multiple 180s. Sounds great. Multiple 180s, multiple echoes. You've got multiple lines of K space that you're filling per slice, per TR, and your scan time goes down, because we all know MRI, it's all about time. You want to scan fast. What's the problem with multiple TEs going into K space? Well, the problem is if I want T1 weighting, but I have a long echo train, those later echoes are getting more and more T2 weighted. So I'm putting T2 contrast into my T1, or supposedly T1 K space. We need to manage that. And that's something called the effective TE, which I'm not going to cover right now. But when I hit pulse sequences after our break, we're going to talk about effective TE and how important effective TE is. So just so you know, just as an appetizer, the effective TE is the desired image contrast, and it goes into the center of K space. So if we want a T1 weighted sequence, we're not going to put the late echoes into the center of K space. We're going to put the early ones, because the early ones are less T2. Okay, so if you want T1 contrast, you put the T1 weighted echoes in your center of K space. Okay, so here's a quick little example. Here is a fast spin echo pulse sequence. There's 5 echoes. Each echo gets longer and longer. So we've got a 10 millisecond TE, working our way out to a 50 millisecond TE. Well, the 50 millisecond TE is much more T2 weighted than the 10 millisecond. So if you want a T1 weighted image, you're not going to put the 50s. You're not going to make the 50s the effective TE, because that's going to put the 50s in the middle. So we have to be careful with what we declare as our effective TE. Also know that as the echo train gets longer, we can potentially get more blurring. And definitely going to get a higher B1 plus root mean squared. Now, this number 3 here, I wanted to bring up. It's very important. I can remember someone emailing me and saying, they asked me this question on the registry. Okay. They said, what can you do if the image is blurry, but the patient is not moving? Well, their answers, I don't remember what the exact answers choice that they gave you, but one of them was decrease the echo train length. And you go, oh yeah, most of the time, oh, it's blurry and the patient's moving. Well, no, there's a difference between blur and patient motion. So a long echo train can cause image blurring. Just so you know, write that down, highlight it, put it in Sharpie. Long echo trains potentially are going to cause blur. The other thing that long echo trains are going to do is they're going to heat the patient up a whole lot more. Now, when you guys are scanning or you're at clinical and you go, oh, my scanner SAR'd out, I got to do something. Yeah, when it says it's SAR'd out, it means that pulse sequence that you're trying to run has got too much RF in it. The SAR level is a line that the scanner doesn't want you to go above with this particular sequence. You're going higher or above, you're exceeding the FDA limits. Okay, that's what SAR means. And you're getting that by RF pulses, either echo trains or SAT pulses and things like that. So really what you're doing when you override the SAR and you do something, either increase the TR or drop your echo train or delete some SATs, right? Those are usually your first few that you go to. What you're doing is you're decreasing the B1 root mean squared, which is your RF exposure. So they could potentially, and be tricky, start to use either one of those terms, SAR or B1 root mean squared. Okay. They could potentially interchange those. So just be mindful. Okay. All right. Inversion recovery, IR. Here's another one of your intrinsic scan parameters. Now, as soon as you hear IR, you're thinking, okay, inversion recovery, something's getting flipped down to 180. Yep, exactly. So as soon as you hear inversion recovery, say to yourself, what's my TI? Because that TI is going to tell you which tissue is going to be suppressed. And the easy way to remember which tissue is going to be suppressed is this. Short TI suppresses short T1 tissue. And nice and easy, the opposite is true. A long TI suppresses long T1 tissue. So what happens is during that TI, so you knock everybody down to 180, during the TI, that's when tissues start to T1 relax. And if their net magnetization vector is in the null point, whatever tissue is in the null point, when the TI is done, that tissue is going to be suppressed. So for example, you look at this curve, top left. Those basically look like T1 curves, do they not? Yeah, they do. Okay. What happens is the tissue's not starting to relax from the transverse plane, but it's starting to relax from the 180 down below. When the tissue's relaxation curve gets to the null point, if you were to start your spin echo pulse sequence, then that tissue is going to be suppressed. So basically, an inversion recovery pulse sequence is nothing more than spin echo, but it starts out with a 180 to invert the tissue. The null point you can really think of as your transverse plane if you want to. They will use null point. That's the term they're going to use, but in the back of your mind, you go, oh yeah, the XY plane. That works for me. That's a little bit easier. Okay, next we're going to move on to flip angle. So as soon as you hear flip angle, you say, oh, that's a gradient echo. Yep, you're exactly right. Because the gradient echo flip angle has a huge contribution to image contrast. So gradient echoes, they have a TR. Every pulse sequence has a TR. You can't get away from that. And a TE. So gradient echoes and spin echoes, they both have TRs and TEs. TR has a big effect on image contrast in spin echo. It doesn't contribute to contrast all that much or hardly at all in gradient echo land. So TE is TE, and that's still for T2 weighting. So the longer your TE, the brighter your fluid's going to be. But that third option or that third parameter in gradient echo land is your flip angle. And that will affect image contrast a great deal. So know that the flip angle, and this, see, it's in red, so you should have this in the back of your minds. The flip angle is how far we're pushing or knocking down the longitudinal net magnetization vector into the XY plane. Are we knocking it down a little, or are we knocking it down a lot? Another thing that the registry likes to use for flip angle is they'll call it the nutation angle, Nutation, nutation. That's nothing more than the flip angle. Okay, again, you've got to know your terminology, guys. Okay, so in gradient echoes, the flip angle is usually something less than 90. It's seldom that high, but it can be if you really wanted to. So a big flip angle in gradient echo land is 60 to 70 degrees, and shallow is in the 10 to 20 degrees. Okay, so what does that mean? So here's a visual on big flip angle or a full flip angle. That's down the bottom in the middle. We're nutating. I'm going to use that term. We're nutating the net magnetization vector. The longitudinal net magnetization vector is getting nutated down to 90 degrees. It's getting flipped to 90 degrees. But a partial flip angle, say, I'm just going to say 45 degrees, which is the top right, the nutation angle is 45 degrees. Okay, so another term that you guys have to remember. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, all right. So again, TR doesn't do much to image contrast in gradient echo land. It will give you more slices and or decreased tissue saturation, but that's about it. So TR has been replaced by flip angle for T1 contrast. I'll get to that in just a second. TE is TE. Long TEs, bright fluid. Short TEs, dark fluid. Flip angle in spin echo land is 90 degrees, unless otherwise specified. So when you knock those protons down, when you nutate them into the 90 degree or transverse plane, they have a lot more T1ing to do. Okay, T1ing, that's a Stevieism. They've got to go from the transverse plane into the longitudinal. So they have a lot more T1ing to do. So because they got a lot more distance to go, there's a much better chance that you're going to see T1 relaxation differences between them. So you can think of the flip angle in gradient echo land as how much T1 you're putting into the echo that you're going to get back. That future echo, is it going to have more T1 in it, or is it going to have more T2 in it? Okay, so high flip angle, T1. Think of it as your volume control for flip angle. Flip angle is your volume control for T1 weighting. Now, let me go back real quick. When I was first learning MR, I struggled with, is this T1, is this T2? What the heck is this? A physicist that I was working with at the time up in Boston, he said, gradient echoes, consider them all T2 weighted until you do something about it. That doing something about it is making the flip angle higher, put some T1 in it, and shorten the TE, take some T2 out of it. Okay, so it's T2 weighted until you change it and make it T1 with a higher flip angle and a shorter TE. Okay, so weighting, we talked about image weighting, T1, T2, proton density. Weighting is a way to term if an image has more of one contrast, either T1, T2, or proton density. So for example, a cup of coffee, if it's got equal parts of decaf and regular, it's not weighted either way. I'm a Starbucks strong coffee kind of guy. So I use this analogy all the time. So if it's half and half, it's not weighted either way. But if you say put in 85% regular and only 15% decaf, well, now that's decaf weighted. And I'm going to go into this and equate it to MRI land in just a minute. So MRI images are similar in that there's only one kind of contrast that should dominate. One of them is going to outweigh the other two. So you got three contrasts, and which one is going to dominate? So for example, in a T1 weighted image, you've got bright white matter, okay, next to not so bright gray matter. So the tissues are either bright or dark because of T1 relaxation differences. So a good T1 contrast is very important in the brain. So T1, we're going to have bright fat and dark fluid. So why do I say gray matter and white matter? Well, white matter has a high protein content to it. It's called myelin. It kind of acts a little bit like fat. It's got a short T1. But gray matter has a lot of water in it. So it acts like water. And we want to see good T1 contrast. That's very important in the brain. Radiologists want good contrast. Now let's flip that the other way with long TR and a long TE to make it T2. You're going to have bright CSF next to grayish white matter because the white matter is a short T1 relaxing tissue. So between CSF and white matter, you're going to get T2 relaxation differences. Again, white matter has a lot of protein in it, and it's got a short T1 relaxing property. So you put something bright next to something dark, and that's contrast. And that's what MRI is all about, contrast. So just to review, TR and TE, TR filters out long T1 relaxing tissues, makes them dark. It's going to let you see short T1 tissues because you're only letting those tissues T1 relax. So here's a Stevieism, and I'm full of these. If you image fast, you're going to see fast, which means a short TR and a short TE, you're going to see fast T1 relaxing tissues. So the opposite is true. The TE is going to filter out short T2 relaxing tissue, which would be fat, GAD, and protein. So when you image slow, long TR and long TE, you're going to see slow T2 tissues. So here's my contrast triangles. I developed these, I don't know, I didn't pattern them, so, but I developed these several years ago. I figured it out. Something popped into my mind one day when I was working for GE. So you've got the three contrasts, T1, T2, and proton density, are inherent scan parameters that we apply to the inherent tissue parameters is going to give us triangles like this. A short TR is going to maximize T1. That's triangle number one. And the short TE is going to minimize T2 contrast. So we'll have bright fat, dark fluid. And proton density is just kind of process of elimination. It's down the bottom. Triangle number two, we're going to use a long TR and we're going to minimize T1. Minimize, put it down the bottom. Short, so a long TR puts T1 down the bottom. A long TE is going to maximize T2 contrast, put it up the top. And then again, process of elimination, proton density is down the bottom. Finishing up, long TR is going to minimize T1. Short TE is going to minimize T2. So process of elimination, who's going to win if you minimize two of the three? The two that are minimized are going to let the one that's not minimized win. Okay, so here's our TR-TE combinations. Okay, so these images here, they're all the same slice, they're all the same patient. So top left, they might say to you is something easy as, what weighting is this image here? Well, you look at it, you say, well, bright fat, dark fluid, decent gray white matter differentiation. I think that's T1, and you would be correct. Bottom left, what weighting is that image? Okay, well, let's see. Fat's not too bright and the water is very bright. So I think that's T2. And again, you would be correct. Bottom right, let's see. Wow, everything's bright here. So everybody's in the transverse plane at TE. So let's see. If everybody's bright, I think that's proton density, and you would be correct. Now, the fourth and the black sheep of our contrast combinations is top right. Yeah, that's a little emoji throwing up. Yep, blah. That is a short TR to maximize T1 and a long TE to maximize T2. So what happens is you get something, you get something that looks like this. I'll go back, guys, don't worry. Slides got out of order. So here's the long TR, a short TR to maximize T1, and a long TE to maximize T2. You maximize two of them, nobody wins. That's pretty terrible. Okay. Hopefully you don't hand in images like that. That would be, you'll get the phone call from the radiologist saying, what the heck are you doing over there? Okay. So when I say good T1, good T1s with good gray white matter differentiation over on the left-hand side, it's T1, fluids dark. That's why gray matter is dark. It's got a high water content. It's T1 weighted. Myelin in the white matter acts kind of like fat. It's got a short T1. It's nice and bright. So that left-hand image is beautiful T1 weighted contrast. On the right-hand side, long TR, long TE. So we've got a bright gray matter because it's got a high contrast. It's got a high water content. So it's bright. And the white matter, because it acts a little bit like fat. It's not fat, but it acts a little bit like fat because it's protein, is going to be darker with the long TE. So let's see. We got a chat here. Let's see. So yeah, any questions, anybody? I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm just going to keep on going. Either I'm totally making sense or you guys are completely confused. And either way, that's what I'm here for. If you've got questions, guys, let me know. That's what I'm here for. That's what you paid the money for. Okay, one last thing. Let's put this all together. We'll bring in proton density, long TR. You minimize T1, short TE, minimize T2. And what happens is tissues that have a high proton density are bright, and tissues with a little bit lower proton density are darker. Okay, all good so far. Good, we'll take that. Okay. All right, so we already went through this. Okay, so once again, here's three images, T1, T2, and proton density. Let me ask you this, guys. Just think about it for a second. Which one of these images of the three, T1, T2, proton density, which one has the highest overall signal to noise? All factors remaining the same except for TR and TE. Which one has the highest overall signal to noise? Just think about it for a second. If you want to chime in with a chat, please do. If you don't, that's okay too. Which one is the higher signal to noise? Okay, well, here's a chat. Here's a brave soul, I think. Yes, Jane, excellent. Proton density. Why? Well, why is it at the higher signal to noise? Because everybody's giving you signal. Everybody's in the transverse plane at TE. Just some people are not given as much signal as others, but everybody's giving it. T1, you're excluding water, for example. T2, you're kind of excluding fat. So you are making some tissues not give signal. So T1 and T2 are high contrast images, but not high signal to noise, whereas proton density has great signal to noise. Good answer, Jane. Okay, and we're going to finish up right here with my image quality triangle. So what makes a good image? Three things: contrast, signal to noise, and resolution. The most important one is contrast. If you don't get something bright and something dark on your image, if they're all the same signal intensity, you got no contrast and the rad can't see what tissue is which. You also need signal to noise. If you don't have signal, you can't see your contrast. And then last is resolution. You've got to be able to see the edges of one structure to an adjacent of another. So you need those three to have a good image quality. All right, so let's review. So all tissues have a unique T1, T2, and proton density. Our inherent scan parameters, TR, TE, flip angle, etc., when they're applied to the tissues, their inherent tissue parameters, they're going to get different contrasts. T1, T2 proton density are going to be made more apparent with our selective TRs and TEs. So the inherent scan parameters are going to maximize or minimize one of the three contrasts. Remember, TR is the time from the first excitation to the next excitation that excites the same slice. TE is the definition from the center of the echo, center of the excitation pulse to the center of the echo. TR controls T1 and TE controls T2. Okay, so question is, with an extremity or spine image or abdomen, for example, just look and know, how do you look to know if it's T1 or T2? Well, the old adage is, when you look at an image, for the most part, and in general, if you see bright fluid, it's going to be T2. If it's got dark fluid, it's T1. Now, one little caveat for that is when you start talking about stir, now you've got something that's not T2, but you got bright fluid. So just in the back of your mind, know that all images with bright fluid are not necessarily T2. So they would have to tell you on this stir image or on this inversion recovery image, what fluids are going to be bright on a short time inversion recovery? Well, fluids are going to be bright. So you need to know your factors there. But in general, look for fluid. And if you see bright fluid, it's T2. Okay, where were we here? All right, so TR controls T1, TE controls T2. TR in gradient echo land doesn't have a whole lot to do with contrast. That's mostly flip angle. Higher flip angles are going to increase T1 contrast. Remember, flip angle is the volume control for T1 contrast. TE is still for T2. Inversion recovery, or the TI, is what suppresses the tissue that have different T1 relaxations. So short suppresses short and long suppresses long when you're doing inversion recovery. Echo train length, it's a series of 180s, each causing an echo, and your scan time goes down by a factor of your echo train length. We're going to do that mathematically when I talk about pulse sequences, because that's where we're going to do scan time math. As echo train goes up, you get more T2 contrast, which is why you want to use a short echo train for T1 weighting, because you want to keep T2 out of your K-space. Echo train goes up, RF exposure increases, and you potentially get blurring. Okay, let's see. And just a quick review of my image triangle. Short TR, short TE is going to maximize T1. Okay, image short, C short. Image long, C long. So a long TR is going to minimize T1, and a long TE is going to maximize T2. Okay, so if you can get a visual on these, it's going to help with what TRs and what TEs. So when you start, you might say to yourself, oh my God, what if they ask me what TR I should use for T1? I really don't think they're going to ask you a specific TR. They might ask you a range at 1.5 Tesla. They might say, well, what range of TRs would be best suited for T1? Well, hopefully you already know around 400 to 750 is a good range for TR for T1 at 1.5. At 3 Tesla, it's going to go up a little bit. I probably doubt they're going to ask you very many specific questions like that. They might ask you, hey, at 3 Tesla, does, true or false? At 3 Tesla, does T1 relaxation get longer? Yes, it does. So if it gets longer, another question they could ask would be, will your should you use a longer TR for T1 at 3 Tesla? Then that answer would be yes. Okay. Does the TI change going from 1.5 to 3T? Yes, it does. We're going to talk about that when we talk about pulse sequences. Okay, so that's the end of this one. I am going to keep on going. I'm going to jump into my next one. Any questions, guys? Don't be afraid.
I do.
Yep.
I do have a.
Sure. What's your question?
Maybe a little choppy from the connection.
Okay.
Yeah, Jane said audio not working. Jane, you can type it in the chat. That's also another option. But anybody else have any other questions? That was a good topic, Steve.
I didn't know you were still here. I thought you were.
Of course.
Oh my God.
The ghost of Christmas present.
Okay. Sorry, I'll put in chat. Okay.
Why is it so hard to get T1 versus T2?
All right. Well, it's really not. You can get, are you talking a particular field strength? Are you talking T1 at 3T, or are you talking T2 at 3T? Any particular field strength? Okay. Well, I'm thinking that you're asking, why is it hard to get T? All right. Now I understand the question. It is a little bit more difficult to get good T1 contrast because you've got a narrower window to get that contrast. Okay. So think of it this way. T2. Okay. Hold on. Okay. All right. So let me answer Jane's first. So, you've got a narrower window of opportunity for T1. You've got a narrow window for TR, and you have to keep a short TE. If you start getting too generous, you lose T1 contrast. Whereas in T2 land, you can use, if you want to run an 8,000 millisecond TR for a T2, knock yourself out. All you're going to do is make that image less T1, right? And you can use a long TE to give you more T2. So as opposed to using an 80 or a 90 TE, which is going to give you bright fluid, if you bumped up to like 120, okay, cool. You can do that. So it's a lot easier in theory to get a good T2 than a T1, because T1, you got a pretty narrow window of opportunity. Okay. All right, so let's see. Does the Ernst Angle apply to gradient echo sequences? Yes, it does. That's an old trick that's been around for a while, especially on, so if you're talking 2D time of flight MRA sequences, for example, MRA sequences are all gradient echoes, correct? So if you up your flip angle, so suppose you've got a short TR and a short TE, but let's say a 55-degree flip angle on your T2 time of flights, your 2D time of flights in the carotids. And you're saying, I wish I could get that background tissue a little bit darker. No problem. Bump up your flip angle. Basically, you're going to get to the Ernst angle and then beyond. And what's going to happen is your stationary tissue is going to lose signal to noise. And that's going to increase your image contrast. Does that make sense, Allison? Does that work for you? Is that what you mean? Okay. Also know that the Ernst angle, it applies to all gradient echoes, not necessarily time of flights. If you keep upping your flip angle in gradient echo land, you are going to lose signal to noise, because the Ernst angle is that flip angle for a given TR, that flip angle that is going to get maximum signal to noise. Okay. If you go past your Ernst angle, signal starts to drop. That's what your Ernst angle is. So it applies to everything, okay, in gradient echo land. Okay, so a question from Nikki. Proton density, from what I've studied, is good for cartilage, correct? Yes. I work on a 1.2 Hitachi, and our knee protocol is almost always PD and PD fat sat. Yes. Almost all your MSK work, there's going to be a stir or a T2 fat sat, because remember, we're following the fluid, right? But you just want to see proton density. Which tissues have a lot of protons? So in a T1, right, what fluid is dark on T1? I mean, excuse me, what tissue is dark on T1? Fluid, okay? So if you've got a meniscal tear, the meniscus is dark, it's black. It doesn't give you any signal. So if you've got something black on something black, okay, that's my phone and that's my remote control. If you've got black on black, what have you got? You don't got no contrast. Okay. Proton density, though, is going to show black meniscus, but because a tear in the meniscus is going to have protons in it, right? And you're going to do something that shows you signal from a lot of protons. Now you're going to have a tear that's showing up in your meniscus. That's why almost all your MSK stuff has got proton densities. I hope that answers the question. Okay, so I am going to, okay, cool. All right, I'm going to close that and I'm going to move on to intrinsic, going to go to extrinsic parameters, and then we'll take a quick break, guys. So off we go. Hello. All right, lost my mouse. Come on, mouse, don't fail me now.
Hey, Steve, I just got to ask,
Yeah.
let's see, who am I looking for here? It's Allison Zorns. If you can just private message me on the chat your ARRT ID number. Okay, it's for your certificate.
Okay, oh, so you're talking to Alice, not me.
Yep, Allison, just Allison, I need your ARRT ID number.
Okay, because you've got mine already. So
yep.
What we have here is a failure to communicate. Okay, so, all right, guys, we're going to keep on going. Extrinsic or geometric parameters. So we're going to talk about field of view, slice thickness, matrix, scan matrix, receiver bandwidth, which is a lot of people's, it's the bane of a lot of MRI techs. If you don't get it, you are not alone, okay? Then we're going to talk about necks and concatenations. All right, so the geometric parameters are, the extrinsic parameters are geometric. We're not talking about TRs, TEs, and flip angles. We're talking about the geometry. What are we doing to our pixel size? Okay, so the geometry, those guys are going to change signal to noise and resolution. Everything else we just talked about for the last hour was contrast. Remember that contrast triangle? The image quality triangle. Contrast is at the top. That's the most important. If you don't have good contrast, you're going to hear it. Now we're talking about geometry, your pixel size. Okay, so first thing I want to make clear here is I've used this term signal to noise. So it's the words signal to noise, SNR, or just S/N, signal to noise. It's a term that we use daily in MRI, and it's nothing more than a simple ratio. So it's signal to noise. How much signal are we generating in our sequence versus how much noise is in the system during the sequence run? All right. And that signal to noise, we're going to talk about that a lot when we talk about necks or signal averages or acquisitions, whatever your system happens to use. So just know that we get signal from the voxels, okay? And consider signal a constant. Okay? We're only going to generate so much signal from these voxels during this sequence run. So we generate a finite amount of signal. What we don't want to do is generate noise, because if we generate a lot of noise, then our ratios get screwed up. So bottom left, we got a big S, so we're getting a lot of signal, and we want to have only a little bit of noise. That's beautiful. That's ideal. But over on the right-hand side, something went wrong. We're not generating a lot of signal. Oh, but our noise just came up. Oh man, this image is lousy. I got to do it again. So if your signal to noise is good, thumbs up. If your signal to noise is bad, you're probably running it again, or maybe there's a system issue, okay? So we talked about contrast, signal to noise, and resolution. So our field of view is going to be a huge contributor to signal to noise. It's a big contributor or a big killer of signal to noise. Our field of view also determines pixel size, because we'll do this math shortly. Field of view divided by your scan matrix is going to give you your pixel size. And I guarantee they're going to be asking you that. They're going to give you this big word problem. This TR, this TE, and the head coil, and the patient's claustrophobic, and they're going to put in all kinds of you know what, and then they're going to say, what's your pixel size? And you've got to go in and tear apart this word problem and find your field of view and find your matrix and do a quick math equation, which we will do in just a minute, okay? All right, so field of view, they might say to you, where does your field of view come from? Well, it comes from your frequency encoding gradient at the end of the sequence. So you've excited, you've phase encoded, you've refocused, and then the echo's forming. When the echo forms, you're going to turn on your frequency encoding gradient, also known as your readout gradient. They love to use that term, readout, because that gradient is turned on while you are reading the gradient. Okay?
Excuse me, Stephen. We can't see the screen.
You can't see the screen. Oh, dear
No.
Lord, what did I do wrong here? Okay, hold on. You know what I didn't do? I didn't share.
I've been there
I
multiple
didn't
times.
share. I'm sorry. Thanks, because I was just talking to myself then, wasn't I? Intrinsic.
Been there.
All right, there we go. All right. Sorry about that, dudes.
There
Okay,
we go.
so let's see. So, all right, here's the second slide. So we want to generate signal. We get it from our pixels or our voxels. We get a finite amount of signal for that sequence. We want to have low noise if we can help it. So signal is what we generate. Noise is what lives in all electronic equipment. So we want to have a good ratio of signal to not much noise. That's the left hand. See, big S, little n. That's going to be good image quality. We're going to have good signal to noise. The reverse of that is when we don't generate a whole lot of signal for various reasons, but our noise comes up. Okay, so our signal to noise ratio is very important. So signal is what we generate. It's basically considered a constant for that sequence. Okay, and we are going to have noise in the background. It's what all electronic equipment does. So we want high signal and low noise, ideally. Okay, so then, all right. So your field of view is a big killer or contributor to signal to noise. And I'm going to show you some math in just a minute. So the field of view is what also determines your pixel size, your field of view divided by your matrix. So again, they might give you this big word problem with all kinds of stuff in it. And then at the end say, what's your pixel size? Just to try to confuse you. So your field of view divided by your scan matrix, phase and frequency. So here we go. So now at the end of it, when you turn on your field of view, comes from your frequency encoding gradient. So you excite, you phase encode, you refocus, and then when the echo is forming, you turn on your frequency encoding gradient, also known as, like I just said, your readout gradient, because that gradient is turned on while you're reading the echo. They love to use that term. So the size of your field of view comes from the amplitude of your frequency encoding gradient. So a shallow gradient, A, is going to give you a big field of view. For example, 400, like it says right there. You're doing an abdomen, you're turning on a big field of view, so your frequency encoding gradient does not have to work that hard. But, now I'm doing a brain. I'm doing a much smaller field of view. I'm doing 200 field of view. That gradient has to turn on stronger in order to make that 200 millimeter field of view. Okay. The shallow gradient is probably going to let you get a shorter TE because the gradient doesn't have to work that hard. It doesn't take that long to come up to strength. The steeper gradient is going to take a little bit extra work to turn on that gradient to the size of the field of view. Okay. Steep gradient, small field of view, takes a little bit more time. So why did I say that the field of view is a huge contributor to signal to a huge contributor or detractor of signal to noise? So let's think of it this way. If you double your field of view and change nothing else, you're going to 4 times your signal to noise. So you double your field of view, you're going to get 4 times the signal to noise, and vice versa. If you half your field of view, you go from 400 to 200, you're going to quarter your signal to noise, because both of those changes, you change the field of view in 2 directions. So you double it, 2 by 2 equals 4. Your pixels are 4 times bigger, or half it, they're a quarter the size that they were. So your signal to noise goes down because you are having pixels and they represent less protons per pixel. Okay, so let's just do, wrong way. Come on, Stephen. Why isn't this changing? There we go. All right, so bigger pixels equals lower resolution. So that's where field of view comes in as far as resolution and signal to noise goes. Bigger pixels equals increased signal to noise, because it's all about putting pixels in the pathology. You want small pixels in your pathology while maintaining a decent signal to noise. The other problem with having big pixels is you get something called partial volume. And this is something else that they like to ask you what the definition is. Okay. Fields of view, large field of view, big anatomical coverage. You get less chance of artifacts, AKA RAP. So big pixels, fewer pixels in the pathology. Bigger pixels have more hydrogen, so you got more signal to noise. But does that skip? I think it skipped. Anyway, let me tell you the definition. I thought I had the definition of partial volume. Maybe it's on another slide. Partial volume means the signal intensity of a particular pixel is the average of all the signal intensities of all the tissues inside. So what I mean by that is you got a pixel that's got some bright and some dark tissue in it. That pixel is going to look gray. That's going to happen when you've got big pixels. Whereas if you go to a smaller pixel, it's going to be a truer signal representation. That's what partial volume. It's an averaging of all the signal intensities of all the tissues in that pixel or voxel. Okay, questions? No, I think that's good. Okay, so let's go on to slice thickness. Now, there's 2 methods of slice thickness adjustment. There's slice select gradient amplitude, and there's transmitter bandwidth. The most common and the most time efficient is slice select gradient change. Okay, so it's basically the same as field of view. So if you have a shallow slice select gradient, you're going to get a thicker slice. The tissues along that slice select gradient are all going to change in precessional frequencies. So the precessional frequencies are not packed in so tight. They're not all crammed in with a shallow or wide gradient application. Okay, so steep gradient is going to be a narrow slice thickness. So 2 millimeters, for example. All those same precessional frequencies are all crammed into a smaller area. So the most common and most time efficient way to change your slice thickness is to change the amplitude of the slice select gradient. You don't know which one your scanner is going to use, but I guarantee you it's probably going to change the amplitude of the slice select gradient. It's more time efficient. And I'll show you that in just a second. All right, come on, you can do this. Come on, there we go. Okay, so here is a transmitted bandwidth of 63 megahertz plus or minus 5. That's a transmitted bandwidth. So you're going to excite a certain area of tissue, a different area of tissue with a steep or shallow gradient. So in yellow, we have a shallow slice select gradient. That range of frequencies along the slice select gradient is in a bigger area. They're not so crammed in. Whereas if you use the same amount of RF, the same RF bandwidth, but increase the amplitude of your slice select gradient, you're going to get a thinner slice. That's the most common and that's the most time efficient. Now, the reason why I say time efficient is when you want a thicker slice, okay? If you use the same amplitude slice select gradient, but you want a thicker slice, you can do that. But you got to put in more RF into that RF pulse. You got to put in more frequencies into the RF pulse, and it takes longer time to apply all that extra or wider transmitter bandwidth, because the RF pulse is an oscillating, it's a sine wave. It's going to go above and below that dark line that's measured 0. It's going to go above and below, over and over and over and over and over again. That's called crossing 0. The more RF, the more time it has to cross that, it needs to cross that line. It's going to take more milliseconds to do it. So as a time-saving thing or time efficiency, you're going to change, more than likely, your scanner is going to change your amplitude of your slice select gradient. You're going to cram more frequencies, more tissue into a shorter or smaller slice thickness. So trade-offs for slice thickness, we call a bandwidth is stated as plus or minus megahertz. So 63 plus or minus 5 means you're going to put in an RF pulse between 58 and 68. That's going to be your slice, that's your bandwidth. If you change your amplitude, you're going to put that same amount of frequencies in a smaller or larger area. The trade-off with that is you're going to increase your signal to noise with a thicker slice. There's more protons. You're going to decrease resolution. You're going to increase partial volume. Here's that partial volume that I was looking for earlier. A thin slice, it's all the opposites, a thinner slice. So 5 millimeters versus 3. 3 is going to have a lower signal to noise. You're going to have higher resolution. We all know that. You're going to be able to see smaller things, and your partial volume is going to go down. And partial volume means that the signal intensity of the pixels is the average of all the tissues contained within. A bright tissue and a dark tissue in the same voxel is going to equal a gray pixel or voxel. So here's your slice select gradient. Here's how, when you turn on. So that is a profile of Abraham Lincoln. He's my favorite president. That's not going to be on the test. So when you turn on the slice select gradient, you are going to change the precessional frequencies of those tissues along that slice select gradient. Okay, so when the gradient's applied in whatever plane you are doing, sagittal, coronal, axial, it doesn't matter. You are going to change that precessional frequency in that direction. An RF pulse is applied to the tissues in the presence of that slice select gradient. So let's just say, for example, you turn on that gradient and you put in an RF pulse. Let's just for yucks and just for ease, if you turn on that gradient and you apply a 61 megahertz RF pulse, his chin is going to resonate. The nose, eyeball, forehead, they're not, because you didn't call their name. And they're all at their own different precessional frequency. And the only thing that's going to respond is going to be at the chin at 61 megahertz. However, if you turn on that gradient, the exact same gradient, and put in an RF pulse of 65 megahertz, then his forehead is going to resonate. So you've got different precessional frequencies along the slice select gradient. Okay, I've used the word pixel a lot. What's a pixel and what's a voxel? They love to ask that question. What's the difference between a pixel and a voxel? A picture is a pixel element and it has two dimensions, height and width, no thickness. Pixels are measured in millimeters by millimeters, height times width. So when you're scanning, it's important to have as many pixels in the pathology as possible, which I've already said. But you still need to maintain reasonable scan time and signal to noise. So you've got to have balance. I had a student ask me one time, how much signal do you need? And I think they were just seeing what my answer was going to be. And I said, enough. You need enough signal to noise that goes along with scan time and resolution. So you need enough signal to get a good picture. So here's an example of 3 different fields of view with 3 different matrix. Which one is going to have the higher resolution? Well, hopefully you said the 16 by 16 because you are going to have smaller pixels. The one in the middle, you're going to have higher signal to noise, but less resolution. And over on the far end, what your signal to noise would be out of that, you would have to do some math. The scanner would do the math for you. But I threw in that 8 by 16 for a particular reason. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So the matrix is how many steps or how many times you divide your field of view in each direction, that being phase or frequency. So pixel size is field of view divided by your matrix. So for example, if they said your field of view is 250 and your matrix is 224 squared, what's your pixel size? All you got to do is divide 250 by 224, and that'll come up to 1.1. So your pixel size is 1.1 by 1.1. Higher matrix numbers means your pixels are smaller, which gives you less signal to noise, but better resolution. Higher matrix gives you better resolution. That's the one on the right, but lower signal to noise because there's less hydrogen represented in each pixel. It's also going to mean a longer scan time. And we're going to go over scan time after we take our break. But our basic scan time formula is TR times phase times next. So the more we divide up our field of view, the more phase steps, the more our scan time goes up. So I put in that oddly shaped pixel size earlier because they may ask you, what is isotropic versus anisotropic? They can ask you that a couple of different ways. So if a pixel has equal dimensions of height and width, okay, left to right. So on the left image, that's equal top and bottom. It's isotropic. Iso means the same. And anisotropic means not the same. An means not. So you've got not isotropic or not square pixels over on the right-hand side. So that would be the example of a phase of a scan matrix of 192 by 256, for example, or 256 by 320. Your pixels are not going to be square if you don't divide them up the same number of times. So Here's a question that I heard was on the registry a while back, and this is going back years, but they said a sequence with a 225 field of view and a 256 matrix will give you what kind of pixels? So as soon as you say, okay, well, they're not going to be square. So that means they're going to be anisotropic. So they might ask you a question like that. Do you know what an versus iso means? Another question that was on the registry was, which matrix combination below will give you isotropic pixels? So you need to look at those and go, which one is which? Okay, so that would be the 160 by 160. Even though you're probably never going to scan a 160 by 160 matrix, it's going to answer the question that they asked you. Even though the answer doesn't seem right to you, and like, oh, I would never scan a 160 by 160. What planet are they on? It doesn't matter what planet they're on. Tell them what they want to hear. Okay, so the number of phase steps directly impacts scan time, resolution, and signal to noise. More phase steps means a longer scan time, because every phase step, just in regular old spin echo imaging, one phase step equals one TR. You're filling in one line per TR. So TR times phase times next. And we're going to talk about that more after we come back from our break. So when we as technologists look at a scan time and you go, oh, 5.5 minutes. I don't think so, Tim. What's the first thing you're going to do? If you're saying to yourself, I'm going to drop the phase matrix, yeah, you and every other tech in the planet is going to do that first. Okay. But what they are going to be asking you questions about is they want to know if you know what changes are going to do, what is going to be the consequences of your action. They have been known to say, what are the effects on signal to noise and resolution and scan time if you decrease the phase matrix? Do you know the consequences of your actions? And you have to know that, guys. So when you drop the phase matrix, what's going to happen to signal to noise? It's going to go up. What's going to happen to resolution? It's going to go down. And like I just said, when you drop your phase, your scan time goes down. So they can ask you these 3-for-1 questions, okay? Just be told. You need to know the consequences of your actions. All right, so what's the difference between a pixel and a voxel? Well, I said earlier, a pixel is basically a dot. It's got height and width, but there's no volume. There's no slice thickness. Okay. So when you hear voxel, you automatically think, oh, my 3D circular Willis sequence. Oh, those have got voxels. Yes, they do. So does 2D. When you do your 2Ds in the brain, you've got pixels, right? And those pixels have slice thickness. So a 2D sequence also has voxels. Don't get locked into 2D does not have voxels, because they do. Okay. Nowadays, the modern scanners now, they're going to tell you voxel dimensions. They'll give you 8 by 8 by 3. Great. Okay. What does that mean? Well, hey, 0.8 by 0.8, those are pretty small pixels. Yes, they are. What's your voxel dimension? Okay. What are your voxel dimensions? They might say to you, what are your dimensions for a 180 field of view and a 256 matrix with 4 millimeters thick? Okay, now you got to do some math. So 180 divided by 256, that comes out to 0.7. I already did that on my calculator when I was making up this slide. So your voxel dimensions would be 0.7 by 0.7 by 4. Pretty easy math, but you got to know that these are probably coming at you. And I would suggest you maybe practice these a little bit. Another question that they like to ask is, what's your voxel volume? Uh-oh. Again, simple math. You're going to have a calculator. 0.7 by 0.7 by 4. So multiply those. That comes out to 1.96 cubic, 3 directions, cubic centimeters. So be prepared to do this math, guys. It's pretty easy once you hear it. Once you see it, it's like, oh, yeah, okay, that's easy. But if you don't know that these are coming at you, you're going to sit there and you're going to start to get stressed. And you don't want to stress when you're sitting for this test. any more than you have to. Okay, so this voxel right here, what if they showed you this pixel, this image, and they say, is that isotropic or not? Is that an isotropic voxel? Well, it tells you that it's not isotropic, but if all you got was 1 by 1 by 4, is that isotropic voxel? No, it is not. Okay, isotropic means the same, so that would have to be 1 by 1 by 1 or 4 by 4 by 4. That's isotropic. So iso means the same. So they could potentially give you a visual and ask you, is that isotropic or not? It's an isotropic pixel, but it's not an isotropic voxel. They've been known to ask what kind of voxels are ideal for 3D reformatting. Well, isotropic voxels are what you want, okay? So when you do your circle of Willis or anything that's 3D, ideally it's, let's just say 1 by 1 by 1 or 0.6 by 0.6 by 0.6. Now you're saying to yourself, wow, those are pretty small pixels and voxels. Yes, they are. So how can a 3D with a 1 millimeter thick slice have good signal to noise? Well, the answer is when you put in your excitation pulse for a 3D sequence, you're exciting the whole volume. Suppose your volume 60 millimeters. That's a great big thick slice. You got signal to noise to burn. But then 3D comes from an additional slice select gradient application that makes your partitions. So yes, a 3 millimeter slice thickness is going to have high signal to noise, but if you drop down a 1, you're not going to have the signal to noise, especially if you're doing 2D. But 3D, all factors remaining the same, you're going to have higher signal to noise with 3D because 3D is not acquired the same way as 2D. Okay, so for example, when you're doing extremely high resolution images, you're looking at the IACs, you want to do a cisternogram, they want to take a look at the IACs, you're doing small fields of view, small slice thicknesses, high matrix. Okay, so you want to use isotropic voxels. That's what rendered that semicircular canals and the IACs over on the bottom right. Isotropic are ideal for reformatting. They've been known to ask you that. Okay, so here's another question. Which set of scan factors will yield the most? Key term here is most underlined, right? Which one is going to yield the most isotropic voxel? Okay, so you look at these 4 answers and you go, all right, which one is outright not going to be isotropic in any way, shape, or form? Well, hopefully you said A, because the matrix is not square. Okay, so now your choices are down to B, C, or D. Okay, you have to do the math here. Which one is going to give you, say, 2 by 2 by 2 or 1 by 1 by 1? You have to do the math here on your calculator and figure out which one. And let me see here. I want to say it was C. All right. If you want to take the time to do the math, knock yourself out. But 225 divided by 224, that's going to come out basically to 0.9 or maybe 0.99 or something, and a 1 millimeter slice thickness. So that's going to give you an isotropic voxel. I hope that makes sense. Okay. Receiver bandwidth and frequency matrix. We're almost done with this one, guys. We'll be taking a break in a few minutes. So when you set up your matrix and you make your frequency matrix a certain number, that's telling the receiver how many times to sample that echo. So down below, those are your blue dots. So that's the work that the receiver has got to do. It's got to measure X number of times. I think down below, I think that's like, there's 33 dots there. So how fast is that receiver going to sample those 33 dots? Okay, that's your matrix. A high matrix means there's more dots. You've got to sample. You got more work to do. More samples equals more work. More work means a longer minimum TE. So the receiver tells how many frequencies are going to be mapped, how many times they're going to map that across the field of view. That's hertz per pixel. The receiver bandwidth tells the scanner how many frequencies are going to be across your entire field of view. All right. So now receiver bandwidth, think of it this way. It's a sampling rate. Are you going to sample all those blue dots at 60 miles an hour and be done real fast? Or are you going to sample it at 20 miles an hour and not be done so fast? So the same thing comes across. Are you going to sample 256 times at 60 miles an hour, or 320 at 60, or 512 times at 60 miles an hour? So your sampling rates, your receiver bandwidth, is either the term that they hopefully should use, because every manufacturer has a different terminology for their receiver bandwidth. They should be using the terms wide and narrow to make it fair. Okay, so if you're going to sample the echo 256 or however many times at a fast rate or a slow rate, you're going to be done with that echo sooner. So sampling a high matrix slower is going to mean your minimum TE is going to come up. So a narrow bandwidth sampling a high matrix means you're going to get better signal to noise, but your minimum TE is going to bump out and your chemical shift is going to get worse. So again, the registry is more than likely going to use wide and narrow. So don't get crazy trying to learn all three of them for the registry. I would hope to keep it fair, they're going to use wide and narrow. So let's look at this visually, which is wide and which is narrow. So a wide receiver bandwidth, as I just said, is a fast sampling rate. It's also going to sample more noise because it's sampling basically the entire echo. It's sampling where the echo is starting to form and there's not much amplitude versus noise. So that black line running across that echo is noise. So over on the left-hand side, circled in purple on the top, we're sampling that echo where the signal to noise is pretty lousy. Then as the echo forms, we're getting the good stuff. We're getting the sweet spot. And then that echo is going to fade away and we're going to sample that not so good stuff. So you sample faster, but your signal to noise is a little bit lower on a wide transmitter bandwidth. Your minimum TE comes down, which is a good thing, but your signal to noise is overall lower. Now at the bottom on the left-hand side circled in purple, that's where you start sampling with a narrow bandwidth. Well, by there, the amplitude of the echo has come up some. It's higher than the noise, so your signal to noise is a little bit higher. So overall, a narrower receiver bandwidth is going to give you an overall higher signal to noise. And they like to ask that kind of stuff. What will a narrow bandwidth do for you as far as signal to noise, artifact, and TE? So you need to know those. So if you remember one of them, the opposite is true. And I got a little graph here, okay? So we're commonly going to use a wide receiver bandwidth on T1s and proton densities because they have higher signal to noise, all factors remaining the same, than a T2. And you'll use a narrower bandwidth on a sequence like a T2 or a FAT-SAT where your overall signal to noise is lesser, okay? What you want to do, guys, when you're scanning is consider FAT-SAT sequences and T2s signal starved because you're taking out FAT's contribution to overall signal to noise. So all factors remaining the same, your signal to noise is going to be lower on FAT-SAT and STIRs. And if you do something that hurts your signal to noise, you're gonna pay the price at the end. Okay, so over on the right-hand side in the middle, that graph with all the blue arrows, you want to memorize one of those. It doesn't matter, pick one. So if you say, well, I like narrow bandwidth because everything's going up. Yeah, cool, great. Know that a wide receiver bandwidth is going to do the exact opposite. So your signal to noise is going to go down with a wide bandwidth. Your chemical shift is going to go down with a wide bandwidth. Minimum TE is going to go down or minimize with a wide bandwidth. And in actuality, motion is going to decrease just a little bit, although I wouldn't use this. I wouldn't widen my bandwidth to try to decrease motion, but because the TE is shorter, motion will be minimized just a little bit, not a lot. Okay. So memorize one of these directions and then know that the opposite is true. Okay. Next, acquisitions and NSA. These all mean the same thing. They're just different acronyms. So NEX is GE, acquisitions is Siemens, NSA is Philips, Hitachi, and Toshiba. So know that when you increase the number of NEX, you're filling the case space more than once, but you're also filling it on successive TRs. So each line of case space is going to, if you say, I'm going to do 3 NEX, great. You're going to fill each line of case space 3 times. So you're going to fill line 1 with TR number 1. You're going to fill line 1 again with TR number 2, and then you're going to fill line 1 again with TR number 3. So it's line 1, line 1, line 1, and then you're done. You go to move up and you go to line number 2. Then that's going to be TR number 4, 5, and 6. You're going to fill them on successive TRs. You're not going to fill line 1 and come back 500 milliseconds later and fill line 1 again, and 500 milliseconds later and scan line and fill line 1 again. Your motion is going to be absolutely god awful. So it's successive lines. Just know that. Okay. Now, when I go up in my signal, when I need some more signal to noise and I go up in my acquisitions, scan time is going to double. So if you go from 1 to 2 acquisitions, scan time doubles. But however, your signal to noise does not. It goes up by a ratio, or not the ratio, excuse me, the square root of the number of acquisitions. So over on the right-hand side, the square root of 1 is 1. That's easy. Square root of 2 is 1.4. So if you go from 1 acquisition to 2 acquisitions, you gain 40% signal to noise at the cost of doubling your scan time. Taking that even further, if you go to 3 acquisitions, you're going to go from 1 to 3, you're going to gain 70% signal to noise. That's great, but I'm sitting here 3 times longer, and the patient's got 3 times longer to move. The only way you can double your signal to noise by using NEX or acquisitions is to go to 4, and that's a very inefficient way to double your signal to noise. Okay, so why doesn't it go up? Hell, I spent twice the time. Why don't I get twice the signal to noise? Because remember, signal to noise is a constant. Noise is a variable. It can go up. So at 2 acquisitions or 2 NEX, you might have low signal to noise on the first one and high signal to noise on the second one, and you average those 2 out. So it's not a direct relationship. And finishing up with concatenation. So what's a concatenation? Well, I know what a concatenation is in MRI land, but Webster's dictionary defines a concatenation as to link together or as in a chain or a series. So in MRI, we use concatenations to keep image contrast. And maybe you've done this during your clinical time, or maybe you're doing it right now. If you need, for example, 40 slices through, I don't know, the forearm. Okay, I need 40 slices of coverage. That's great. But my TR is over 1,000. That's not T1. How am I going to do that? Well, you can do a couple of things. You can split up your stack and do 20 and 20, or you can tell the scanner, do 2 concatenations. So do half the slices at half that TR, and then go do the other half of the slices at the other half of the TR. So you're still getting your 40 slices. Your TR comes down to 525, and contrast is maintained. Okay, so you can manually do 2 concatenations. You can even go up to 3 if you want. Scanners will let you go 3, 4, 5. Okay. But mostly concatenations are used to keep T1 contrast. And that also works very well for fat-sat images too, because don't forget, fat-sat is going to add to your TR because it's extra work. Extra work means extra TR. Everything we do in MRI is related to how much work. Everything has to get done within your TR period. Okay. All right. So let's real quickly go over those scan time formulas that I just, those different formulas that I went over. Pixel size is your field of view divided by your matrix. Your voxel size is your pixel dimensions times your thickness. Okay, so 0.7 times 1.4 times 2, for example, it's a 1.6 cubic millimeter. Also know that signal to noise in a 3D versus 2D, it's the square root of the number of partitions. So have you ever noticed when you're doing a 3D sequence, as you go up in partitions, oh, I need a little bit more coverage on this circle of Willis. So you go up a couple of locks, your scan time goes up, but so does your signal to noise. It's a square root relationship. Okay, I'm going to skip past this signal to noise and partitions right now. I'm going to go past that because we'll talk about that later. Square root, I mean, the signal to noise of a sequence, as far as nex or acquisition goes, is a square root relationship. So the square root of 1 is equal to 1, square root of 2 is 1.4, and right on down the line. So to double your signal to noise, you need to do 4 times the acquisitions, and that is going to mean 4 times the scan time. And Larmor frequency, just to throw that in at you, you are going to be asked that, I'll bet, a cup of coffee. So wobble is equal to B0 times Y. So wobble or precessional frequency is equal to the field strength, the main magnetic field in Tesla, times 42.57 megahertz. Megahertz, that 42.57 is the gyromagnetic ratio of hydrogen at 1 Tesla. That is a constant, and they ask it all the time. What is the gyromagnetic ratio of hydrogen at 1 Tesla? Okay. They can also ask you the dreaded Gauss per the Gauss conversions. Okay. It's actually rather easy if you think about it, and you need to think of terms of 1,000. Okay. We use that terms of thousands every day. Milli means 1,000. So a millisecond is 1,000th of a second. Okay. A millitesla is 1,000th of a Gauss. The common one that they ask all the time is our pacemaker, right? When you say a pacemaker can't go past the 5 Gauss line, 5 Gauss is equal to 0.5 millitesla. So that's just something you need to remember. So if you know 5 is equal to 0.5, then if they said 1 Gauss is 0.1 millitesla, it's a nice, easy conversion. Okay. And these I've kind of beat to death, so I'm just going to keep on going right through them. Anybody have any questions? Just feel free to hit me up. I'm going to pause this right now, and I'm going to let you guys take a break for the bathroom or a drink of water, and we'll come back here in, let's see, what time is it? It is 12:52, so I'm pretty much on time. So let's give this about 10 minutes, guys, for a break, and we'll come back. Okay. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I am going to pause recording, and we'll come back. And if you have any questions, guys, just put them up on the chat board. Okay. Now I can share my screen. Okay, so
right.
as far as Ernst Angle goes, okay, Ernst Angle. So for a given TR, all right, so constant TR, as you change your flip angle, as you increase your flip angle, you're going to get more signal. Okay, so flip angle is running this way. I know I'm a terrible artist, so just bear with me. So for a constant TR, let's just say 500 milliseconds. If you increase your flip angle, say to 10 degrees, okay, you're going to get a certain amount of signal. If you go to 20 degrees, you're going to get a certain amount of signal. And then 30 degrees, and then 40 degrees, and then let's say 50 degrees. Well, what's going to happen is, so let's just say this is 50 degrees right here. If you go up to 60, what happens is your signal starts to drop. And then 70, you know, it keeps on going. Do you see a pattern here? So for example, for a given tissue, 50 degrees is your Ernst angle. Signal to noise increases. Signal to noise increases as flip angle increases to a certain point. And then all of a sudden it is going to start to drop. So any flip angle over 50 degrees is you're going to start losing signal to noise because the tissue doesn't have time to, the tissue doesn't have time to, okay, come on, we can do this. Tissue doesn't have time to T1 relax. Tissue doesn't have time to T1. It's got time to T1 relax here. It's got time to T1 relax here, but by right here, it doesn't have time to T1 relax in the 500 milliseconds. So flip angles higher than 50, for example, you're going to lose signal to noise. Does that make sense? Is that a little bit better explanation? Hopefully it is. Okay, so let's minimize that. Okay, and we're going to stop share. All right, so hopefully that works for you guys. Let's see, 2 chats. Yes, okay, thank you. All right, cool. All right, so now we're going to go back. Now we're going to talk about pulse sequences here. Pulse sequences, there we go. All right. Share my screen again. There we go. All right. So we're going to talk about pulse sequences. And we're not going to talk about every single one, but we're going to hit the high points. So first question is, how many kind of pulse sequences are there? Well, if you guys start saying, oh, there's stir, there's FLAIR, there's T2, there's FAT-SAT, there's all this other kind of stuff. Well, no. There's only 2 real kinds of pulse sequences. Okay, they're either spin echo based or gradient echo based. Everything else is just a variation on any one of those 2. So conventional spin echo, fast spin echo, stir, FLAIR, DWI, gradient echo based. Then you got gradient echo, which is the conventional that you do, say, in the brain for looking for hemorrhage, time of flight, things like that. So there's really only 2 kind of pulse sequences. So one registry question might be, they'll just show you this line diagram or this pulse sequence design and say, well, what sequence is that? And you would say, don't say T1 or T2 or whatever, because you don't have TRs and TEs to back that up. But if you see a 90 and a 180, ding, 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 it is spin echo based. That's all. Look for the 180, and if it's there, it's spin echo based. It might be as simple as that. If they show you a pulse sequence and there's no 180, then guess what? Gradient echo. So don't let all this slice, select, phase, and frequency encoding stuff get you confused right now. We'll cover some of that. So if there's a 180, is a 90, 180 complex, it's spin echo. If it's doesn't have a 180, it's gradient echo. Okay, so here's your basic gradient echo pulse sequence. Look what's missing. I got it circled in red. There is no 180. So if you were to just see something as basic as this, no 180, that's gradient echo. So pulse sequences, like I said earlier, are a very rigidly timed series of RF pulses, gradient applications, and then reading the echo. Very, very rigidly timed. So each one of these things has its own job to do. So for example, number one, that's on, well, it says it's on the RF line, so that's easy. So that's the excitation pulse. Simultaneously, there is a slice select gradient applied, whether that's whether that is axial, coronal, or sagittal, you don't know, but it's just the slice select gradient. After you excite, you're going to put in a phase encoding. That's number 3. Notice how it shows gradations here, because the phase encoding gradient is changed every TR, because that's what's going to put this eventual echo in a different line of K-space. And then after you phase encode, you're going to frequency encode. You're going to turn on your gradient to frequency encode and that echo. That's why it's called read. So the frequency encoding gradient is on during the echo formation, also called read. So you're going to apply that frequency encoding gradient and measure the frequencies during that echo formation. Okay, so this image here happens to be courtesy of Siemens Medical, and this is more like what you're going to see. Those other ones that you just saw, those are mine that I did up on PowerPoint. They're a little bit crude, but Siemens has graphic designers and they can make it much better. So what you see here, you know, what pulse sequence is this? Well, it says it, gradient echo, but what do you see that there's not one of? A 180. So one of the things that they might ask you is, a gradient echo is sensitive to or is affected by what 3 things? So that's line 4 coming down. Because there's no 180, a gradient echo is susceptible to what I call the big 3. Main magnetic field and homogeneities, local field and homogeneities, and magnetic susceptibility differences. Those 3 things help drop or affect lower the signal to noise, whereas a spin echo with the 180 corrects for those. So all factors remaining the same, a gradient echo versus a spin echo, gradient echo has a lower overall signal to noise because there's no 180 that cleans up for those 3. So the question here would be, what are the 3 things that will affect signal to noise in a gradient echo? Main, local, and magnetic susceptibility differences. So let's go through those real quick. So again, I call them in my classes, I call them the big 3, okay? These terms here, they should not be new to you. You should have heard these at least a couple of dozen times before. So main magnetic field and homogeneities is B0, is the main magnet that you're putting your patient into. How good is it? How perfect? The manufacturers try to make it perfect, but they just really can't. I mean, come on, there's no things in this world that are perfect. And then they're not perfect to begin with. And then guess what? We put the patient in there, and they're the biggest cause of field and homogeneities going. They've got air in them. They've got a heart that's beating. They got flowing blood. Maybe they've got a mouthful of braces or something. That's going to affect the field homogeneity. So that's the main magnetic field. The local field could be something as much as they've got a knee replacement. Well, there goes your field homogeneity. If you're scanning the knee, that knee replacement is going to mess up the field homogeneity. Okay. They got dental work, surgical clips, spinal hardware. That's going to affect the field right where you're imaging, if you happen to be imaging that area, okay? Things that can really make the magnetic field really bad is, say a stray oxygen bottle. Yeah, hopefully that's never happened to anybody. That'll ruin your day. And then there's magnetic susceptibility differences. And this gets worse at 3T, these susceptibility differences. But susceptibility is a tissue's ability to be magnetized. Basically, does it like to be magnetized or does it not like to be magnetized? So water, for example, is considered diamagnetic. I'm going to go into these. Diamagnetic actually repels the magnetic field just a little bit, whereas ferromagnetic is going to attract the field a little bit. That's one of the reasons why an oxygen bottle will go flying. And then there's then there's paramagnetic, which is what gadolinium is, and it only brings the field in a little bit. I got some graphics on that. So if you've got two tissues that are different in susceptibility, you're going to mess up, those are going to mess up the precessional frequencies right there, and you're going to get basically a little black hole, a little small area of signal loss. So here's an example of a lady I did from the ER a ways back, and she was not having a good day. This is a gradient echo pulse sequence. I know you can't see the factors all that well, but however, the gradient echo doesn't have a 180, so it doesn't clean up for those little areas of hemorrhage that are in her brain. So why do these show up as dark spots? Well, because there's no 180 and you've got iron, you've got blood that has hemoglobin. Hemoglobin contains iron, which is a metal. So the little magnetic fields right around where that blood is changed. And when you change the magnetic field, what do you always do? You change the precessional frequency. So you get these little areas of signal loss. So you cause increased dephasing because the iron changes the field and it makes the tissues dephase quickly. So let's go into flip angle a little bit more, okay? Or actually a review. We already went over flip angle quite a bit in the other section, but when we talked a little bit about spin echo already, and now we're going into gradient echo. So all sequences, like always have a TR and a TE. Gradient echo has a third parameter, flip angle, and it's how far will the net magnetization vector be tipped into the XY plane or nutated. So the flip angle, it can be associated with that signal, like a funny looking A right here. Okay. That just means it's a flip angle. It's not denoting that it's 10 or 20 or 45 degrees. It's just a little A. That means flip angle. So as you see something like that, you automatically know, ding, 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 this is a gradient echo and there's no 180. So they might ask you, what's the flip angle in a spin echo pulse sequence? And hopefully you go, I don't know what it is. Well, it's 90 degrees because we've said 90-degree excitation pulse how many times in our life. So the flip angle for a spin echo is 90 degrees. Gradient echo, it's usually something less than 90. Remember, if the flip angle in gradient echo land is basically the T1. How much T1 are you putting into those protons? Are you putting a lot with a big flip angle or not so much with a lower flip angle? So you've basically seen this slide before as well. So a flip angle is how far you bring things out of the transverse plane into the XY. Okay, out of the longitudinal into the XY. So that's T1. So right here, a full flip angle means the tissues have more distance to T1 relax, go back to 0, or they have more spin lattice to do. So that's going to be more T1 weighted versus this guy right over here where you only partially flip them into the transverse plane. They don't have that much T1 to do. So the chances that you're going to see T1 contrast, you're going to see T1 relaxation differences between them is less. Okay, so this would be T2 or T2 star weighted. So remember earlier I said that a gradient echo is T2, well actually T2 star weighted until you do something to make it more T1. And more T1 means a higher flip angle, more RF going into the patient, and a short TE, because we all remember TE controls what? T2. Long TE, more bright fluid. Short TE, less bright fluid. Okay, so box A is an example of a high flip angle where there's going to get more T1, and box B over on the right-hand side, less T1 is being put in, so you're not going to get T1 contrast. So remember, what you put in, you get out. Okay, so gradient echo, once again, I know I'm beating this to death, but it's real important to understand the concept. It was earth-shattering when it was explained to me that way. So they're T2 weighted until they're not, till you make them T1 with flip angle and TE. So you can theoretically make a proton density gradient echo. We never do. I mean, there's really no call for that, but theoretically it's possible. Okay, now we've done spin echo, we're done with gradient echo, and now we're going to go into fast spin echo or turbo spin echo. The original name for fast spin echo was RARE, R-A-R-E. Like, how do you like your steak cooked, sir? I like it cooked rare. That means rapid acquisition with relaxation enhancement. That was the old original name. So it's basically a spin echo with multiple 180s. Multiple 180s is your echo train length. Okay, so this particular pulse sequence right here is courtesy of Siemens Medical. So I don't want you to think that I did. I made that up. No, I'm borrowing it from them. So fast spin echo is plain and simple, just a faster spin echo. More 180s, more RF, more echoes, more lines of case space filled in your TR. So in this particular case here, we've got a 3 echo train. We're filling 3 lines of case space per slice, per TR. And for example, a 6-minute pulse sequence in spin echo land here is going to go down to 2 minutes. You're cutting your scan time by your echo train length, by a factor of your echo train length. Okay. Okay, so now turbo or fast spin echo weighting, okay? Short or long TR and TE concepts, they still apply. So short TR, short TE, and a short echo train is going to give you T1. Okay, so short, short, and short. The same thing is true for T2. Long TR, long TE, and a long echo train is going to give you more T2 weighting. But when you start adding in all these echoes, now we've got multiple contrasts, right? Because as the TE gets longer, fluid's going to get brighter. So you can't put T2 contrast into a T1 case space. You're going to start causing contrast differences, okay? So we're getting multiple echoes per TR. We need to manage those contrasts. I got that highlighted in yellow. We need to manage those multiple contrasts that are coming in per TR. So we need to selectively place them in case space for our desired contrast. All right, the TE is in fast spin echo is now going to be called effective TE. So you got 3 echoes. Do you want your first one in the center of case space, or do you want your last one? If you look at this example, do you want your first one put into your center of case space, or do you want your last one put into your center of case space? That's going to change your image contrast. Remember, in case space, the center lines of case space give you mostly image contrast and signal to noise, while the outer edges give you edge detail and not much signal to noise. So look at this example right here. Here's a fast spin echo. There's a 4 echo train. Okay, so great. So our scan time just got cut down to a quarter. You're filling multiple lines of K-space per slice per TR. Each one of those echoes gets a little bit more T2. So how do we put those echoes where we want them? We're going to change the amplitude of the phase encoding gradient. So we did slice select, and we phase encoded this echo. Then we 180'd it with the same slice select gradient, and then we frequency encoded that echo. Now, because of the amplitude of this phase encoding gradient, this echo right here is going to go to the edges. High amplitude phase encoding gradients cause the echoes to go to the edges of K-space. Notice as we continue down the line here, the phase encoding gradient is getting shallower and shallower. It's less steep. That means that these echoes that get the weak phase encoding gradient amplitude, so this echo here is going to go into the center of K-space. Note that all the gradient amplitudes are all exactly the same. Slice and frequency are exactly the same height and length. The only one that changes is your phase encoding gradient. Every echo gets a different phase applied to it. So that goes into a different line of K-space. So from what I'm just saying right here, what I just told you, this last echo right here was declared our effective TE. This guy, because of the weak amplitude phase encoding gradient, is going into the center of K-space. So why am I taking that much time to go over this? Well, because you have to be careful with your echo train lengths. You can't use an extremely long echo train length in T1 land, because we need to put the good stuff in the middle. And if we don't have a whole lot of good stuff, if we got greedy with our echo train length, now the wrong contrast is going to start crowding the good stuff in the middle. So just remember, in K-space, center gives you contrast, CC, kind of like CC and Coke. Okay, when you go to a bar, you order a CC and Coke. It's Coca-Cola, and I think it's Crown Royal, the whiskey and Coke. Remember, CC, center, gives you contrast. The outer edges, the outer lines gives you edge detail. Where we put our echoes is huge in fast spin echo land. Okay, so for example, here's that line diagram again. Depending on what we picked for our effective TE, that's what's going to go into the center of K-space. Okay, so we got to manage these multiple TEs. By managing them, I mean we're going to apply specific phase encoding gradients to these echoes. All right, so here's the slide I was hoping to get to, or I wanted to get to quicker. So we've got a 3 echo train, like you just saw right here, 3 echo train over on the left-hand bottom side, 3 echoes. Which echo goes in K-space is going to be determined by the phase encoding gradient. So we've got 3 echoes, and I said to the scanner, my effective TE is going to be the 10 millisecond. I want the first one to go into the center of K-space. And the scanner says, yep. So it's going to start off with the weak amplitude phase encoding gradients, and the gradient amplitude is going to get a little bit higher as you go through the echo train. And then once you're done with your 3 echoes, you move on to the next slice. Next time you come back to slice 1, it's going to be the same thing. Weak amplitudes first, stronger amplitudes to the last couple of echoes. And that's going to put the 10s in the middle of K-space, so your image looks like a 10 millisecond TE. If I said, no, I don't want the 10 in the middle, I want a 30 millisecond TE, scanner will say, sure, Steve, no problem. And it will apply the strong amplitude gradients to the first echo and the weak to the last echo, the 30. So it's going to put the 30s in the middle. And I'm going to show you a picture right here. Okay, exact same pulse sequence, exact same slice, exact same patient. I declared the effective TE is 10 milliseconds on the left. My 10 TEs went into the middle, and I get a nice T1 weighted axial, dark CSF, decent, I think pretty good gray-white matter differentiation. Okay, good T1. Oops, I made a mistake, and I said I want a 30 TE here. And the scanner said, sure, Steve, no problem. And it put the 30s in the middle. Now look at those two images, figure 5.7 and 5.6. Which is the better T1 weighted? Hopefully you said 5.6 because the CSF is darker. With the 30 TE on the right-hand side, I let too much T2 contrast come in. And it's starting, the CSF is starting to brighten up. So that's how we manage our echo train, okay? By declaring an effective TE, apply the weak amplitude phase encoding gradients to the desired TE and put the less desirable stuff on the edges to fill in those lines of K-space. Okay, inversion recovery. Inversion recovery sequence will be timing an RF, an inversion 180 pulse, and exploit the T1 relaxation differences of fluids or even fat. Okay, so we can make fluids dark on purpose. We can make fat dark on purpose. So as soon as you hear IR, you start thinking to yourself, something's getting suppressed. Most of the time it's CSF in the brain, and a lot of times for MSK and in the spine, we're doing fat. Okay, so recall that tissues have a distinct T1 and T2 relaxation. Okay, they're actually opposite. So fat is fast. The first two letters of fat is the first two letters of fast. Fat is fast to T1 and T2. Water is slow to T1 and T2. So they're opposites. So an IR sequence, it can and will suppress other tissues. Other tissues with similar relaxation times to fat or similar relaxation times to water are going to be suppressed. So an IR sequence, it kind of suppresses everybody who's got a fast T1, or it suppresses everybody with a slow T1. It's not selective. Fat sat itself is very selective, and I'm going to go there in just a minute. So what are some examples of fast T1 tissue? Well, I said them the very first hour. Fat, GAD, and protein are fast T1 relaxing tissues. So if you do a stir with a short T1, you're going to suppress fat, GAD, and protein. If you use a long TI in, say, FLAIR, you're going to suppress CSF and urine if you wanted to, but no one does FLAIR in the pelvis, so you don't have to worry about that. So we're going to have three variations of inversion recovery. We got stir, short time or short tau inversion recovery. We've got FLAIR, fluid attenuated inversion recovery, which can be T1 or T2 weighted, and we'll cover those in just a minute. Okay, so let's talk about a basic inversion recovery line diagram. So it starts off with a 180 and then turns into a spin echo. So basically, if you see a 180, 90, 180, ding, 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 that is inversion recovery. You don't know whether it's stir or FLAIR because they're not going to tell you what the TI is. But if you see 180, 90, 180, it's inversion recovery. They can ask you, what happens during the TI? Well, the answer there is T1 relaxation is happening. We're letting the net magnetization vector of those protons reach the null point or not. Okay, so the TI lets tissues T1 relax. Remember, fat T1 relaxes faster than water, which is huge. So the 180-degree RF pulse knocks everybody down. So before the 180, they're all pointing up at B0. They're all pointing with B0. After the 180, they all get inverted. They're all knocked down. They're all pointing the opposite way. So during the TI, tissues T1 relax. We're going to use TIs that are short or TIs that are long, so we can selectively suppress either fat or CSF. So over on the right-hand side is my version of an inversion recovery pulse sequence. It's a little crude, but it gets the job done. Over on the left-hand side, that might be more what you're probably going to see. I don't know if they'll take it right from Siemens Medical, but it'll be a lot prettier than mine. Okay, so 180, 90, 180. Okay, bingo, that's inversion recovery. You don't know if it's stir or flare because there's no TI stated. Don't get that particular about it. Now, the first one that I'm going to talk about is stir, short time inversion recovery, or they can also call it short tau inversion recovery. Tau, I think, is Greek for time. So that's why it can be called short tau inversion recovery. Classic look for a stir is dark fat, bright fluid, very similar to a T2 fat sat. Fluids that we're going to be suppressing are going to be CSF, or that we're going to be seeing signal from in a stir is CSF or edema. Remember I said earlier in MR, we're following the water. So on stir, we're going to see bright fluid, bright edema. So the TRs are very important, believe it or not, in stir and in flare, but especially in stir. So if you ever do a stir and you look and you go, boy, that's awful long scan time. Wow, that's almost 5 minutes. How can I save some time? And you say, ooh, look at all that extra TR I've got. I'm going to cut that down. Yep. And you knock it down till, I don't know, 1400 milliseconds. And your images come up and they're terrible. That's because you shortened the TR too much and you are saturating fluids, which is what you're looking for. Stir, you want to see fluid. Tumor, infection, radiation necrosis, you want to see the water. So don't shorten up that TR. Don't fall into that trap. Because remember, the body's reaction is to force fluids to some area of insult. The TE in stir is usually in the 30 to 60 millisecond range, just to help the fluids be a little bit brighter. You go too long, you're going to start hurting your overall signal to noise. Field strength is also going to change what TI you use, because don't forget, field strength changes the T1 relaxation of tissues. And during the TI, we're letting tissues do what? Hopefully you said T1 relax. Okay, so that's stir, okay, short time inversion recovery. Okay, usually the TI for stir is about 150 milliseconds at 1.5, and it's about 190 to 200 at 3 Tesla. Are they going to ask you that? Probably not, but I'm going to give you some math that we can figure it out if you want, because the TIs are going to change from field strength to field strength. FLAIR, fluid attenuated inversion recovery, of which there are 2 kinds. There's T2 FLAIR and T1 FLAIR. So T2 FLAIR, just remember, long, long, and long. Long TR is classic in all T2 weighted images. Long TE, classic for T2 weighted images, and a long TI. That's going to help suppress CSF. So T2 FLAIR, long, long, and long. T2 FLAIR, the long TR is going to do what? Suppress T1 contrast. The long TE is going to maximize T2 contrast. And the TI suppresses signal from CSF. Now, how can I maximize T2 for bright fluid, right? Steve, you've been saying that since we started this. But however, I want to make fluid be dark. Yeah. You're going to make fluid be dark with the TI. If you have the right TI, you'll suppress CSF. But the long TE is going to let you get gray-white matter differentiation. That's exactly the same as a regular old spin echo T2. So if you look at a T2 FLAIR, the gray-white matter differentiation is the same as T2, but the TI is what makes the CSF dark. Okay. Next time you do a FLAIR in the brain, you'll see it. I'm pretty sure I got some images coming up. Now T1 FLAIR. Well, long TR because we have to accommodate that long TI. but we're going to use a short TE. So that doesn't change. Go back to spin echo land. Short TE takes away T2 contrast. So we're going to get a better T1. Okay, so T1 FLAIR is long, short, and short. Don't be like this guy banging his head on the screen. Don't do that. Okay, so just remember when asked, remember your basic ranges or that basic principle. Okay, break down a big problem into a smaller problem, because I just gave you all kinds of variables here, right? Make a big problem into a smaller problem. Okay, basics. Short and short is T1. So we're going to have a short TE and a shorter TI, T1. You're going to have long and long. That's going to be T2. Another easy way to remember this is a short TI suppresses short T1 tissues. Long TI suppresses long T1 tissues. Okay. TI times for fat are going to be around 150 to 170 milliseconds. That's common. Will they ask you that? Probably not. But you should know that we get the TIs for whatever tissue that we want to suppress by multiplying its T1 relaxation time by 0.69. So just roughly the T1 relaxation time for fat at 1.5, I think is about, it's about 240, 250 or something like that. If you multiply that by 0.69, you'll come up with a number right around 150. So that's how those numbers get devised, okay? There is no definitive TI. So for them to start asking you definitive numbers is not fair. They're not going to do it. They might say is approximately, but they're not going to, okay? TIs change also by radiologist preference. Some guys want a little bit longer TI. Some guys don't. That's radiologist preference. Okay. They may ask you what TI will be used to suppress fat. Well, go, wait a minute, hold on. Fat is fast, so I need a short TI. So short suppresses short. And long, what do you do for water suppression? You need a long TI because water is a long T1 relaxing tissue. Very easy principle. Okay. So again, where do those numbers come from? You multiply the T1 relaxation time of a tissue, no matter what tissue it is, multiply it by 0.69, and that number you get is going to be the TI that will suppress it. So here's that little formula that I just used. So the T1 of fat at 1.5 is approximately 220 milliseconds. You multiply 220 by 0.69, it comes up to 150. So if you make your TI 150, you'll suppress short T1 relaxing tissues at 1.5. Same thing for 3T. About 290 is the T1 time for fat. Multiply that by 0.69 and you come up with about 190 or so. Again, there's no definitive TI. It's just simple math. So you saw these curves before. So they might show you this curve and say, what curve is that? Well, you go, wait a minute, hold on. It's a T1, but wait a minute, it's starting way down at the 180. Oh, 180, that's inversion recovery. So you know this stuff, okay? You're just not used to answering the questions. So right is a T1 relaxation curve, and it shows two different tissues, fat and water. We got a fat being fast, it gets through the null point quicker. So if we apply our, if we apply our 90, so we apply to 180 and we weight the TI. When fat gets here, if we turn on and start our spin echo pulse sequence right here, we're going to suppress fat. If we invert everything and wait and wait and wait and wait, then when water gets to the null point, this is when the 90-degree pulse comes in. This is where the spin echo sequence starts, okay? So as long as tissue has met and gotten to the null point, we will suppress it with the correct TI. Now, let's talk about fat sat. Fat sat is sometimes called chemical shift. Everybody, when they're sitting there scanning, they all say fat sat because it's easier to say than chemical shift imaging. But guess what? those two terms are interchangeable. They can throw, well, when you do chemical shift imaging, blah, 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 chemical shift means FAT-SAT. What's FAT-SAT? FAT-SAT will put in a series of selective RF pulses that are tuned specifically to fat. So the RF pulse that gets put in, excuse me, is at the precessional frequency of fat. So fat gets excited multiple times. Water does not, because remember, they're at different precessional frequencies. So FAT-SAT uses a selective RF pulse, whereas inversion recovery uses a non-selective. Everybody gets knocked down. Everybody gets a participation award. Everyone gets knocked down with stir and FLAIR. The reason why we can do FAT-SAT, or specifically do FAT-SAT, is because of something called chemical shift. Now, you know there's a chemical shift artifact, which I'm going to talk about, but what happens is when you put the patient in the magnet, fat and water go to their own little selective precessional frequencies. Fat is a fast T1 relaxing tissue, but it's slow. It's slower than water because it's a big molecule. It doesn't rotate as fast. So when I say selective, I mean we're specifically targeting fat with a RF frequency that's at the Larmor frequency of fat. Down below, that's inversion recovery, because you can see that it says TI right here. Okay. Why did I call the bottom sequence inversion recovery and not stir and FLAIR? Because there's no TI stated. So if you saw this diagram right here and they said, what kind of sequence is that? You're going to know that it's inversion recovery. Okay, so why does chemical shift imaging work? Well, like I just said, we're taking advantage of the chemical shift or precessional frequency difference between two chemicals, fat and water. Let's just call them chemicals. Okay, it's nice and easy. So precessional frequency is the precessional frequencies of tissues is directly proportional to magnetic field strength. So recall the Larmor frequency from a couple of hours ago. Again, you're going to need to know that equation. Whoa, boy, nice and easy. Whoa, boy, wobble is equal to B0 times, I believe that's called lambda. And the number is 42.57. I bet you any money they're going to ask you that. But anyway, precessional frequency of hydrogen at 1 Tesla is 42.57. At 1.5, 63, and at 3, it's 127. So as water speeds up, so does fat, but just not at the same rate. They can ask you this question right over here. Fat precesses, what is the precessional frequency difference between fat and water? Very open-ended, very generic question. Well, if they ask you that, you just say it's 3.5 parts per million. Because note that I didn't state a field strength. 3.5 parts per million is the difference between fat and water. And you've got to remember that. But as soon as they throw in a field strength, that's when you need to start doing some math, okay? So no field strength, noted 3.5 parts per million. If they state a field strength, that's when things change. So let's put this into a little bit of perspective. So if you put the human body into a magnet and you speed water up to 1 million hertz, 1 million revolutions a minute, fat is going to follow suit, but it's going to be a little bit slower, just ever so slightly slower. So look, 999,997.5. If you add 3.5 to that, you're going to get 1 million. Now, speed up, increase that field strength a little bit, and speed water up to 2 million. Well, fine. Fat is going to go 1,999,993. That's 7 revolutions less, or 3.5 times 2. Do you see a pattern developing? Okay. So then if we say, all right, well, we want to put this patient into a 1.5 Tesla magnet, Well, water speeds up to 63.85 million hertz. Cool. Multiply that by 3.5 parts per million, and you're going to come out with 223.47 hertz. Just call it 223. The millions on either side of that equation cancel out. So the precessional frequency difference between fat and water is 223. That's by my math right here. Most people, most techs that have been around for a while are going to say, 220, close enough. Yeah, that's fine, 220. What if the registry asks you that question and they don't say 223, they say 220? That's the next closest answer. Give it to them. Tell them what they want to hear, okay? The answers, the variables, the potential answers that they give you may not be exactly what's in your head. You might say, well, Steve Powers said 223, but the closest answer they gave you is 220. Yeah, fine, close enough. Give it to them. Tell them what they want to hear. Okay, so for all you GE users out there, I took this right off a GE screen, and here's your chemical shift. You got two chemicals, fat and water. Fat with the blue arrow, fat is the yellow arrow and water is the blue arrow. That's the precessional frequency difference at 1.5, because fat is a big, slow molecule. Water is a small, fast molecule. If that was done at a 3 Tesla scanner, those peaks would get even further apart, because precessional frequency is directly proportional to field strength. We can do fat sat because now we've separated the precessional frequency sufficiently enough. We can put in an RF pulse that targets fat and fat only with a selective RF pulse. Okay, that's how we do fat sat. That's chemical shift imaging, not chemical shift artifact, but chemical shift imaging. Okay, so let's move on to time of flight MRA. Time of flight, another nice word for it is flow-related enhancement. Those two words, those two terms are equally interchangeable. So what time of flight means is it's the time that blood flies into the slice before it flies out. So we're imaging extremely quickly. We're getting signal from blood before it goes away. Okay. Flow-related enhancement, time of flight, same thing. Excuse me, I'm getting a little bit dry here, guys. So with flow-related enhancement, we're going to be using TRs and TEs that are shorter than the T1 and T2 times of the tissues. So basically, we're going to be setting up a steady state in the stationary tissue. Keyword there was stationary. So the stationary tissue is going to be basically suppressed. It's going to be saturated with RF. It's not going to give us hardly any signal because we're not giving it time to T1 relax. Due to the flow, we've got fresh spins that come into that slice. They get excited with the RF and they have a short TE so we can grab their signal before they go away. Now, I couldn't separate all these little JPEGs, but we're imaging that slice. We're exciting the blood. We're collecting the signal from the blood before it goes away. The background tissue, we don't care about. We want it to be dark. We want it to be saturated. So you get bright vessels, dark background. That's what the very short TR and TE do for us. Okay. So again, the TR and TE that we use are shorter than the T1 relaxation time of stationary tissues. We don't see TRs and TEs this short with spin echo, do we? You're not getting 15 to 20 millisecond TRs in spin echo land. You're not getting 5 to 7 millisecond TEs in spin echo land because you just can't, because of the presence of that 180. That 180 burns a lot of time. So with those really short TRs and TEs, the stationary tissue is basically stuck at the flip angle. It's in a steady state, and the signal is going to be low. It's going to be dark background tissue, bright vessels. What's happening is the blood is flowing in and flowing out. Notice these These fresh spins are coming in and out. In the slice, acquire the signal, move away. Whereas the imaging slice is going to be dark. Okay, so registries like to alternate these names. I already said that to you. Flow-related enhancement equals time of flight. I really like this, this slide that I've got here because it shows the spins very nicely. So you got the imaging slice that's being hit constantly with RF, and blood flows in, gives it signal, goes away. New blood comes in, gives it signal, goes away, and on and on. Okay, then when we're done with that slice, we move on to the next one. So you have dark background tissue, bright blood vessels. Now, we always have biphasic flow. What do I mean by that? Well, there's arterial flow and there's venous flow. How are we going to make one side of that flow dark? So we want to do an arteriogram. We're doing that nice and easy. Just think carotids. You guys have probably done hundreds of carotids. Blood flow is going north. It's going into the brain. So from the heart up. Well, at the same time, we've got venous flow coming down, right? That's the way it is. That's the way it works. Babies cry, MRIs make noise, and blood flows in two directions. So how are we going to make this only one-sided? Hopefully you just say to yourself, wait a minute, I know what I can do. I can add a SAT pulse. That's right. So a SAT pulse is going to be placed on the side of the blood you don't want to see. So in this particular case, we're doing carotids. We're doing axials in the carotids. Blood is going up the neck into the brain. Venous blood is coming down through the SAT pulse. So it's getting hit with an RF before it even gets into the slice. And then the slice gives it a double whammy and it gets another RF pulse and it turns dark because now it's saturated. Even though it's flowing, it got pre-excited. That's why sometimes the SAT pulses are called pre-SATs. So you're going to put the RF pulse on the side of the blood you don't want to see. That's nice and easy in the carotids, okay? But they like to ask, where should you put the SAT pulse for doing whatever venous or arterial flow? They like to ask this, where should the SAT pulse be placed when image veins below the heart? Uh-oh, hold on. Wait a minute, veins below the heart. All right, so nice and easy. Just think nice and easy. Think in the popliteal, think the knee. So venous blood is coming up the leg towards the heart, but you want to see the arteries in the knee. Where do you put the SAT pulse? Hopefully you said below your slices because you want to take out venous blood. They like to ask this kind of question, okay? Right here, okay? So there's the heart beating away. Arterial blood is going to the head. Arterial blood is going to the feet. You want to do a venous SAT to show the artery. So just got to think logically, guys. Which way is my blood flowing? Okay. I bet you any money they're going to ask this question because they did on my registry, and that was a long time ago. Okay. All right. Now, DWI, diffusion weighted imaging. It's done basically on every brain that you ever do. It's an indispensable tool looking for strokes, and it's getting into being used for tumors as well. It's very useful in detecting ischemic areas in the brain because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be able to see differences in contrast because of the diffusion. In the brain, the brain doesn't have an outright blood supply. Everything, all the blood that it gets, or all the nutrients and water and other such things, it gets through diffusion. Brain cells do not have an outright blood supply, okay? So just like in T1 weighted images, where we get T1 contrast from T1 differences in the brain, DW images, we get our contrast when tissues are having differences in diffusion. So DWI exploits random molecular motion called Brownian, or sometimes called the sodium pump, different tissues, if they have their blood supply or they don't have their blood supply, they're going to have different amounts of diffusion going on. The extent of capillary tissue movement of stuff in the cell, okay, is going to depend on whether the cell membranes is intact and if there's a blood supply. So Brownian motion, maybe that's a new term for you. Some people call it the sodium pump, but Brownian motion, if you look it up in Webster's, is a random motion of molecules in a medium, liquid or a gas. The pattern of motion usually consists of random fluctuations in a particle's position within the fluid. So basically it's going wherever it wants, okay? Because there's a blood supply to the brain cells, it can move stuff, the brain cells can move stuff in and out at will. But when there's no blood supply, you have something called restricted diffusion. Now here comes the gradient part of it. When a gradient is applied, and this goes for all MRI, when you turn on a gradient, stationary tissue is going to pick up phase, right? It always does. But moving tissue, for example, stuff that's moving in and out of the cells is going to be, when it's moving, it's going to pick up even more phase. So it imparts phase to everything, just some get more than others. And that's the moving, that's the Brownian motion within the cells. So picking up phase because they're moving is going to mean a loss of signal. That's a rule in MRI. When you turn on a gradient, things get dephased and they lose signal. So stroking tissue doesn't have a blood supply. It's not diffusion. There's no Brownian motion. And when you turn on those gradients, there's no dephasing happening in those cells. So they are going to not lose signal. They're going to stay bright. The unhealthy tissue does not have stuff moving. It's going to stay bright. Unaffected, healthy tissue with the blood supply, it's moving stuff. It loses phase. So you're going to have dark tissue next to bright tissue. And that's contrast. And that's diffusion contrast because you're getting different amounts of signal from different tissues. What does it look like? What's a DWI look like? Well, right there you go. Oh, that's a spin echo. Yep, you're right. It's a spin echo, 90, 180. If you said that, excellent, double thumbs up. But what about those extra gradients on either side of the 180? The heck are those? Those are the diffusion weighted gradients that are being turned on in order to make tissue either pick up phase, the good stuff, and the stuff that's not moving is not going to pick up phase. So something's going to be bright, something's going to be dark. And then at the end, where you see all those echoes, you'll notice that there's a bunch of gradient reversals. That's textbook what a EPI sequence looks like, echo planar imaging. So we're going to excite, we're going to phase encode, we're going to DWI it, and then we're going to turn on that frequency encoding gradient dozens and dozens of times very quickly and get echoes from each reversal. So that's a spin echo DWI. You see those extra gradients that I've got circled in green. So what's this diffusion thing? Well, I've already gone through most of it, okay? Cells want to be nice and healthy. They want to be able to move in what they need and move out what they don't. So they want to bring in nutrients and they want to remove waste on a cellular level. So stuff's moving. When stuff moves, we turn on a gradient, they get dephased, they lose signal. Sodium pump stuff is not working when it loses its blood supply. So you get restricted diffusion. Turn on a gradient, stuff that's not moving doesn't pick up phase. Now, what do I mean by phase? So here's a real quick down and dirty DWI graph, okay? The DG are diffusion weighted gradients on either side of the 180. And there's usually 3 directions. So we are going to DWI it in the slice direction. We're going to DWI it in the phase. We're going to DWI in the frequency direction too. You always do 3 directions. Just so you know, there's 3 pairs of DW gradients. But let's just keep it simple with 1. Okay, so you turn on that first diffusion weighted gradient right here. So you have some protons that are in phase. Then you turn on the gradient and they dephase. So their vectors say go down this way. Well, the green is moving. That's going to go down even further. It's going to pick up more phase down here, down the bottom. The blue tissue is not moving that much. It's restricted. So it doesn't dephase as much. Okay. And then you turn on another gradient and you're going to refocus them. And they're going to come above this line. And then when you DWI them again, they're going to go back to where they were. But one is got a lot more phase. Okay. That is the restricted diffusion. That's the blue. That's the water. So you dephase it and you dephase it on purpose. Then you rephase it and you bring it back in. And at TE, something's going to be bright and something's going to be dark, whether it's moving or not moving. That's your DW contrast. So you're going to get low signal from normal tissue. You're going to get bright signal from abnormal tissue. You've all seen those DWIs where someone's had a stroke. Here's another down and dirty DWI pulse sequence. I don't know how many of these you've seen, but it's a spin echo based DWI. How do I know it's DWI? There's extra gradients right here. This happens to be from the X gradient, extra DW gradients that aren't normally there. So this is a DWI sequence and it's EPI because we're doing all these gradient reversals causing echoes. Okay, now what's this B0 thing that I've said 18 times? The B value measures the degree of diffusion weighting being applied. It's an indication of the amplitude of your DWI gradients. Okay, how strong these guys are, how long are they applied for, okay, because time runs from your left to the right, how long do we turn them on for, and what's the time duration between the two of them. A larger B value is going to have increased amplitudes, be applied longer, and a wider time. So all factors remaining the same, combine to all these factors combine to diffuse the tissues more or less. A high B value is more sensitive to a stroke than a low B value. Typical B value is around 1,000 to 1,500. Will they ask you that? Probably not. But they might ask you, is a 500 B value more sensitive to a stroke than a 1,000? I think that's a fair question. So the 1,000 is more sensitive to a stroke. So now, let's identify some pulse sequences here. Okay. Yep, wrong one. All right. So top left, what do you see? Well, you see a 180. So you go, 90, 180. That's spin echo. Absolutely. What about top right? You see a 180, 90, 180. What do you think that is? Hopefully you're saying it's inversion recovery. You don't know if it's stir or flare, but it's inversion recovery. What about bottom left? Gradient echo. Why is it gradient echo? Wait a minute, there's a 90 there, isn't there? Well, don't let that confuse you. That arrow in the line, that means less than or equal to 90. That means it's a gradient echo. There's no 180. And then over on the bottom right, that's a fast spin echo. So you might see these. So you need to be familiar with your identifying your pulse sequence line graphs. Over on the left-hand side, what kind of graph is that? Hopefully you guys said T2. In the middle, what kind of relaxation curve is that? T1. And last but not least, over here on the right-hand side, what kind of pulse sequence is that? Well, you might have said it's EPI, which you would be correct because you got all these frequency encoding gradient oscillations. But you see these two guys right here, that makes it DWI. So it's a DWI EPI. Okay, so let's do some scan time formulas. A lot of the texts that I know are kind of weak at this, and this is something I want you to practice. You need to do this multiple times before you go sit for your registry. So the basic line diagram, the basic scan time formula is TR times phase times nex. And that's going to give you a great big number in milliseconds. Great. Easy math. TR times phase times nex. That big number in milliseconds, you need to convert to minutes and seconds. So then you're going to divide those milliseconds by 60,000. 60,000 is the number of milliseconds in 1 minute. So TR times phase times nex equals your scan time that you need to divide by 60,000 to give you minutes. Now, here's something that I want to say before we continue. Sometimes they will say, what is your scan time in milliseconds? Easy peasy. TR times phase times nex. You don't divide by 60,000. They didn't ask you for minutes and seconds. They asked you for a scan time in milliseconds. Okay? Slow down, read the question. What are they asking me? They didn't ask me to divide it and make it into minutes and seconds. They just asked for the scan time in milliseconds. So you're nervous, you're stressing. Oh my God, slow down, read the question. What are they asking me? They're going to give you the answer. You just need to figure it out because they're going to give you 4 possible answers. 1 or 2 are absolutely wrong, and the other 2 are probably pretty close. You've got to get the best answer. Okay. So that being said, 500 times 256 times 2 equals 256,000 milliseconds. All right. If that's all they ask you for, then that's what you're going to give them. But if they say, what is the scan time in minutes? Well, now divide the 256K by 60K, and that's going to come out to 4.26 minutes. Is that 4 minutes and 26 seconds? No. You got to do one more step. So 60 is how many seconds? You got to multiply that by 0.26. That comes out to 15.6. So the scan time here is 4 minutes and 16 seconds. Pretty easy math, but you got to know what they're asking you, okay? You need to practice that, like I said. Okay, here's one more. So let's throw a T2 at you. 3,456 TR times 192 times 1. 663,552 milliseconds. Divide it by 60,000, and that comes out to 1105. 60 times 0.05 is 3 seconds. Your scan time here is 11 minutes and 3 seconds. Pretty easy math once you practice it a few times. Okay. Change of pace here. Okay. Okay, so Allison said, okay, would it say 192 by 256? Do you only worry about the 192? Yes, because phase 99.9% of the time, the phase number is going to be lower than your frequency number. It's easy if they said 192 by 192, you don't have to worry. But you're right, 192 the lower number is going to be your phase steps. And if you've got the time, and you've only got a limited amount of time here, guys, be careful. Maybe if you've got time, do it both ways. Use if you're not sure which one is which, okay? If you're not sure which one is phase and which one is frequency, do the math twice. And if your numbers are completely out of control, you know that you did the frequency wrong. Okay. Yeah, that's what you were wondering. So 99.999% of the time, phase is going to be less than frequency. If they're nice guys, they'll tell you which one is which. Okay. But you can't always count on them being nice. So you do this math, you come up with 73,727. Okay, that 60,000, where is that coming from? Well, when you multiply milliseconds by a number by a number, you come up with a scan time in milliseconds, okay? Now we need to make this milliseconds into minutes. Hold on. 60,000 is the number of milliseconds in 1 minute. So if you've got a great big time in milliseconds that you need to make into minutes, you have to divide by 60,000. It's the number of milliseconds in 1 minute. So yeah, there's a bunch of little math here, but you've got to know the processes. There's only 3 basic scan time formulas. We just did regular old, let's just say spin echo. Now we're going to do fast spin echo. Same basic formula, TR times phase times nex. Okay. All right. So TR times phase times nex is going to give you your scan time in milliseconds. Now, fast spin echo is the key term here. You need to divide your time in milliseconds by your echo train. Okay. So what is that? 13,271,000. Divide that by your echo train length, 18, 22, 6, whatever the echo train. They're going to have to state the echo train. Divide that by 60,000, and you're going to come up with your time in minutes and seconds. Okay, you need to try this, guys. You need to practice this. Don't just say, yeah, I got this. No, don't do that to yourselves. Practice it. Okay. All right. So that's your fast spin echo scan time formula. TR times phase times nex equals milliseconds. Divide that by your echo train, divide that by 60,000, and you're going to come up with your scan time in minutes. Okay. All right. Now, I just skipped that one real quick for time. All right. Now, 2D or 3D sequential sequences. That's the other white meat. Okay. So they can say in this 3D time of flight MRA, and you're saying, okay, no problem. Lay the factors on me. TR times your phase times your nex. Now you got to multiply it by your partitions. Some places call it locations. Okay. They're going to tell you that. 3D or 2D, they have to tell you the number of slices because that's going to change your scan time. So TR times phase times nex times 64 is your scan time, okay? Then divide it by 60,000, just like you've done 3 or 4 or 5 times, whatever, how many times we've done it. And that's going to give you your scan time in minutes and seconds. Again, it's easy math, but you've got to practice this stuff, okay? Because practice makes perfect, okay? Any questions, guys? We need to forge on here. Yeah, I've still got a little bit of time. All right, so we're going to forge on. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I am going to go to my other PowerPoint. Okay, good. We still got it there. All right. Okay. Artifacts. There we go. All right. Share my screen. And artifacts. There it is. All right, guys. We're rounding third, heading for home. I know you're tired. Guess what? So am I. Okay, so don't forget, lay the questions on me if you've got them. So I'm not going to do every artifact known to man. I'm going to hit the biggies. Okay, so what's an artifact? If they ask you, what's an artifact? It's false information. It's something that's not really there, or it's something that shouldn't be there. There are 3 basic kinds of artifacts, or 3 sources of artifacts. Physiological, which is patient moving. Inherent, which is the physics. And then there's hardware, which is coils and other electronics. I'm not going to break down each one of these, but I'm just going to run the list. So what you really need to do, guys, is you need to have maybe a little list, and you need to know which artifact goes in which direction, for example. So if you're looking for, if you've got an artifact and you're not sure what it is, and you're saying, well, wait a minute, that's in the phase direction. Well, guess what? If it's in the phase direction, it's not chemical shift, or it's not anafact. So it's a process of elimination. So know the directions of your different artifacts, which way they go. There's a couple that go in both directions. And then, okay, it just helps you with the process of elimination. Okay, so we've all seen images like this, okay? Motion. Motion is always in the phase direction, and it's considered a data sampling artifact. You can get it from, obviously, from patient breathing, which is what that one is. You can get it from pulsatile flow or peristalsis. Again, it's all concerning the patient's moving. Okay, so so they might just show you an image like this and say, what artifact is demonstrated here? Okay, either one of those. Well, hopefully you just went, oh, yeah, that's motion. Yeah, because it's an evenly spaced, rhythmic kind of motion in the phase direction. They won't probably show you which way phase is running, but you can tell, damn, that's motion. What happens is, or why you get motion only in the phase direction, is because there's a lag time from the time that you put a phase encoding gradient on and the time you acquire the echo. Because remember I said the phase encoding gradient's applied for the future echo. Remember I said that? I don't know, a long time ago, a lot of words ago. Okay, what happens is you phase encode the tissue and it's at place A. Great, okay. 10, 12, 20 milliseconds later, you acquire that echo. That tissue's not there anymore. It's in place B. And there's this smearing. So it kind of brought its phase with it. It smeared it across the bagel, as it were. You smear the cream cheese, you smear the motion in the phase direction because of that time lag between phase encoding and measuring that echo. So they might ask you, what are some of the ways to decrease motion? Well, you can't scan dead people. Even though you might see dead people, you can't scan dead people. Insurance doesn't pay for that. Well, you want to make sure they're comfortable. Coach them up. Hey, listen, I'm going to need you to hold your breath when I say it. Or listen, it's going to be loud. Don't let that bother you. You need to immobilize them, pat them, strap them, keep them still. Scan fast, and you can also use motion suppression techniques. So here's an example of, hey, what artifact is demonstrated here? Well, you can see my red arrows. It's pulsatile flow because the blood was moving through the gradient. It picked up phase, and it kind of dropped it off in the phase direction. Okay, it's evenly spaced, repetitively spaced artifact. That's classic pulsatile. That happens to be stir. And why is it so bad on stir? You guys have probably noticed, man, I always see this motion on stir. Always. Well, first of all, inversion recovery is just terrible for motion just because and in general. And also long TR and long TE sequences are more prone to motion. They're also more prone to pulsatile. So a lot of your stirs and flares and things like that, you should have flow comp on to help make that go away a little bit. So the image on the right, no flow comp, real bad pulsatile flow. The image on the left, well, flow comp is on, it's a little bit better. What's flow comp? Flow comp, sometimes it's called gradient motion nulling, is a way to lessen the amount of phase shifts that are measured at TE. So it uses a paired bipolar gradients after excitation, but before signal readout. So what's the consequence of turning on flow comp? All factors remaining the same. Flow comp, extra gradients. Steve just said that. Extra gradients means more work, right? It's going to bump out your minimum TE. So it's a pair of unequal and opposite polarity gradients that are applied, and it compensates for phase shifts induced by blood flowing through the slice select gradient. Kind of sounds like DWI, doesn't it? You turn on a gradient and you're going to make phase shifts happen. So what we're going to do is if you turn on one gradient and it causes phase shifts, if you turn on a pair of gradients after the fact, you can correct for those phase shifts. So that's exactly what we did here. It's not perfect, but it works a little bit better. So here's what it looks like, for example, in a quickie little line diagram. So you've got blood flowing, okay? You've got stationary tissue, which is blue. You've got moving tissue, the blood, which is red. You turn on this gradient. Well, they were in phase, but guess what? After the gradient, now they're out of phase. Ding, ding, ding. Oh, I'm going to get that pulsatile flow. Okay, I don't want the pulsatile flow. Steve just turned on flow comp. Okay, so you're going to turn on bipolar, opposite polarity gradients, so that this one here is going to overcorrect, and then the +1 is going to recorrect, and at TE, those protons are going to be in phase. If you do the math, you got a +1, a -2, and a +1. You do that math, it comes out to 0. So you don't have, theoretically, you have no phase shifts at TE. Extra work, it lengthens your minimum TE. Okay, what's another common artifact? Okay, this happens at my place all the time. And it's not that we have a bad Faraday cage. It's just that the techs at my place think nothing of just blasting into my scan room while I'm scanning. That's a pet peeve of mine. But anyway, so all MR rooms, just like X-ray rooms, they're shielded. They're RF shielded. It's not lead, it's brass or copper. And it keeps our RF in and it keeps somebody else's RF out. When other people's RF gets in, sometimes our coils pick it up. And over on the right-hand side, you can see that zipper kind of artifact. And that's RF, that's classic RF. Sometimes it's just a single, like down the bottom. Sometimes it's multiple, like up the top. If there's multiple, it's a wide bandwidth of RF that got into your room. Notice its position. Now, granted, phase and frequency is swapped on this, but however, RF or zipper artifact it's in the phase direction, but its location up or down, or in this case, right or left, it comes from what the frequency was. So it's not always in the exact same spot. So it's an RF artifact that's seen in the phase direction, guys. It's one of those, that's one of the only ones that's kind of opposite. You go, oh, it's an RF. Why isn't it in the frequency direction? Because it's not. Its location is frequency dependent in the phase direction. Aliasing, wrap, or fold over. Don't know which term they're going to need. Which term they're going to use. Okay. So unfortunately, you have to know all three of these. There's no way I remember what they used on mine, but I'm hearing that they use aliasing, but who knows? Know all three of these. So wrap comes from having tissue outside the field of view in the phase direction. So the scanner will fully sample the tissue inside the field of view. You put this, you put your little box up there over your brain, and it's going to sample everything in that field of view. It's going to sample it very nice. Everything gets an RF, even the stuff that might be outside the field of view. Even though you don't want it to, sorry, we're doing a square field of view and RF is round, okay? Just because it's outside the field of view, it's going to get an RF pulse. So this tissue outside the field of view is going to get undersampled. You don't look at it enough to know exactly where it should go. Undersampling it or not sampling it enough does not satisfy something called the Nyquist theorem. The Nyquist theorem says you need to sample an analog wave at twice its frequency to get an accurate picture of its true form. Okay, so you see that little sine wave that's moving from left to right. If I sample it enough and then connect those dots, yeah, I got a pretty accurate depiction of what it looks like, so I know where it should go in K-space. It's pretty easy, okay? Sampling it at twice, it's at the minimum of twice. Here I sampled it 5 times, so I really got a good picture of it. So the Nyquist theorem is satisfied there. The scanner knows where to put that echo. Now, if I don't sample it enough, same sine wave. If I don't sample it enough, and then I connect those dots, that high frequency sine wave looks like a low frequency sine wave. And the scanner is going to say, yep, okay, it goes over here. It doesn't really belong over there, wherever there is. Okay, so it's not, you didn't satisfy the Nyquist theorem. You didn't sample enough. This is what happens when your tissue is outside the field of view and doesn't get sampled. Actually, it doesn't get sampled at all because you're only telling the scanner, just look at my field of view. There's stuff outside. It got excited. It's going to give signal whether you want it to or not. Okay, so the Nyquist theorem is not satisfied. This right here is going to give you RAP. You've seen RAP a million times. It's one of the most common things. They might just show you a picture and say, what artifact is demonstrated here? Okay. Now, the nose over on the bottom right, that's pretty obvious. Okay. The one at the top, yeah, that's pretty obvious too. The shoulders are wrapping in. And the lower leg, that's, once you get it pointed out to you, go, oh yeah, that's RAP. That's RAP from the lateral side of the calf getting wrapped in. So again, that might just show you pictures and say, what artifact? Okay. RAP, 3D sequences can RAP. RAP is not only limited to the phase direction. You can get RAP in the in the slice select direction. You get that in 3D slices, 3D data sets. So that's called slice RAP. So the top image here, you can see very nicely the foramen magnum that I've got circled in red. But what's all that other stuff on the outside? That's the top of the head. So you got the bottom wrapping into the top. And when you went to the top, you could, you get RAP. So the top wraps into the bottom wraps into the top. And that's called slice RAP. And once again, that's because tissue is outside the field of view and it gets mismapped and gets put in the wrong spot. Chemical shift artifact. Now, we're not talking chemical shift fat sat. We're talking chemical shift artifact. Now, what happens is you got a difference in precessional frequencies. Chemical shift means a difference in precessional frequencies between fat and water. So we took advantage of that to do fat sat. We've already been through that. But we also are a victim of chemical shift when you got differences in precessional frequencies between fat and water. So one time we take advantage of it for good. Another time we're a victim. And unfortunately, it can be kind of a bad thing. So chemical shift, 3 factors that affect chemical shift or the severity of chemical shift is your field strength. Are you at 1 Tesla versus 3? Higher fields, you get worse chemical shift artifact because precessional frequency is directly proportional to field strength. So those 2 chemicals start to precess at higher and higher different frequencies. So far, so good. So field strength is a major contributor to chemical shift artifact. Your field of view. If you have a small field of view, the artifact is going to get worse because what you're doing is you're trying to put more frequencies into a pixel. A pixel can only hold so much or so many frequencies. Okay, so it's the, it's the 5-pound, 10-pound bag thing. You can't put 10 pounds of potatoes into a 5-pound bag. Okay, so what happens is you can only put 10 pounds of signal into a 5-pound pixel. What happens is it oozes out. And because you're trying to put more frequencies in there, it oozes out in the frequency direction. So chemical shift is always in the frequency direction. Another big contributor to receiver bandwidth. So receiver bandwidth, I said this earlier, it maps how many frequencies are put across your field of view. So if you try to put too many frequencies in your field of view or into each pixel, you're going to get chemical shift artifact. Okay. So each manufacturer, and this is where I was going with this earlier as far as receiver bandwidth, every manufacturer uses a different term to describe their receiver bandwidth. GE uses kilohertz. Siemens uses hertz per pixel, and Philips uses fat water shift. They're all the same, but they're different. Okay. So in order to make that easy, I would hope and think that the registry is going to use wide and narrow, and I believe that's what they're doing. So anyway, so we've got fat and water peaks here. Okay, that's the chemical shift. Okay, so water is at your center frequency, and fat is halfway to the minus over on the right-hand side. As field strength increases, these two peaks get further apart. Well, if you're trying to fit all those frequencies into one pixel, it may not fit. So when we're doing fat sat, we're exploiting or taking advantage of that chemical shift. But in chemical shift artifact, when we're not doing fat sat, we're going to be a victim of that chemical shift. And just so you know, there's two kinds of chemical shift. Chemical shift of the first kind and second kind, like that last line says. I'm gonna cover both of those. Okay, so here's chemical shift of the first kind. We're trying to put, so that middle pixel, that black dashed box, that's your pixel. We're trying to put too many frequencies into it. What's going to happen? Well, it's going to ooze out into the next pixel. So then you're going to start getting fat and water canceling each other out. So on that kidney, where there's a fat water interface, okay, the red lines are pointing to the artifact. You see this chemical shift at fat water interfaces. So the kidney is a lot of water and it's surrounded by fat. So it's classic to see it around the kidneys. So you get a black line on one side of your image and a white line on the other. That's classic chemical shift because you're trying to put too many frequencies in one pixel. Maybe the way to fix that is going to be to widen your receiver bandwidth, and that will lessen the artifact. Okay, so here's the kidney again, exact same picture that you just saw. Okay, the artifact is seen at fat water interfaces, okay, right here, black line, white line. You also see it, it's kind of subtle, but I'll bet you any money you don't even notice it on your spines. Okay, here is a spine at 3T. You can see the black line here and the white line over here. That's classic chemical shift, and it's seen in the frequency direction. They might say to you, what artifact is demonstrated here? You know, question whatever. Oh, that's chemical shift. Yep, good, 2 points. How do you fix that artifact? The easiest, quickest way to do it is to widen your receiver bandwidth. Use a smaller field of view or go to a 1.5 Tesla scanner, but that's not practical. If you saw that artifact, you're not going to say, I'm going to get them off my 3T and put them on the 1.5. That don't happen. Artifact is in the frequency direction at fat and water interfaces. You can fix it with receiver bandwidth. That's the quick, cheap, and easy way to do it. Okay, now, chemical shift of the first kind up top. You only see chemical shift on spin echo and fast spin echo sequences. Okay, you can only see it on those two. Okay, that's chemical shift of the first kind. It's because you've got frequency differences, not phase differences. Chemical shift of the second kind is down below. Hopefully you looked at that and you went, oh, that's an out of phase TE. Look at the black line around everything. Ding, 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 ding. I owe you a cup of coffee. That's exactly right. That's chemical shift of the second kind, also known as out of phase TE. What's happening is at that specific TE, in that gradient echo sequence, you've got fat pointing, let's just say right, and water pointing left. They cancel each other out. It's out of phase or phase cancellation artifact. A couple of names for chemical shift of the second kind. Out of phase or phase cancellation. You only see that out of phase TE on gradient echoes. You never see it anywhere on anything else ever, ever, and forever. Why? Let you stew on that for a second while I drink my tea. All right. You never see the phase cancellation or out of phase TE on on spin echo because the 180-degree refocusing pulse puts everything in phase at TE. So even if you pick the right TE, they're not going to be out of phase. The 180 degrees doesn't let that happen. Whereas gradient echo, without a 180, it can happen if you pick the TE correctly, or if the TE is right. Okay. All right. So that's chemical shift of the second kind, also called out of phase or phase cancellation artifact. Crosstalk and cross excitation. Now, almost everybody uses these two terms interchangeably. Sorry, I don't. Maybe I'm being pedantic, but I don't teach them that way. So these two terms, like I said, are interchanged. Almost everybody says crosstalk. I don't teach it that way. All right, so here's crosstalk. Crosstalk comes when there's RF in common between slices. So on the left, figure 1220, okay? Slice 1 and slice 2 have a little bit of RF in common, okay? Look at those numbers. Okay, so 64 to 66 in slice 1, and then slice 2 is 66 to 68. Well, what's in common? 66. So when you excite slice 1, you're exciting just a little bit of slice 2. So the overall signal to noise of slice 2 is going to be just a little bit lower. Is it, oh my God, look at that crosstalk? No, but it happens. Look at slice number 3. What's in common? The 68. So when you excite number 2, you're also exciting just a little sliver of number 3, because we think that our slices are square, and we'd like them to be, and that's what we think. But guess what? We're not going to get something square out of round RF. So notice the blue RF, it's round. We want a square slice, and we almost kind of sort of get it, but we don't get it particular, exactly. We have something called full width at half maximum. This is where we get our slice thickness. So that big dome, that big pyramid, that big pointy thing, that's your RF pulse. Halfway up and full width, halfway up, that's our slice thickness. Notice that the blue area over here, this is crosstalk. So we are exciting slice 1, but a little of 1's RF gets into slice number 2 because RF is not square. That's why we get crosstalk. So your signal to noise drops a little bit in slice number 2. Okay. How do we avoid that? Can we make that go away? Yes, we can. We can minimize that a little bit. We can put sorry, guys. Come on, work with me here. Come on, computer. I know you're tired. Why is it doing this? Okay, we can put a gap in between slice 1 and 2. There's already a gap there. That's how it shows. But we can gap or we can interleave. Would be a way to get rid of crosstalk. Skip some tissue in between slice 1 and 2 and not let the overlap of 1 get into 2. Move 2 over a little bit. Okay, now cross excitation. You guys have seen this artifact before. If you've done a lumbar spine, you've seen this artifact before. Everyone calls it crosstalk, and that's fine. But I call it cross excitation because tissue from the yellow slab is common to the next slab above it, okay? So here's L5S1, here's L45. This tissue in common here is what's getting cross-excited. So when you excited L5S1 and then moved up to L45, this tissue hasn't had time to T1 relax. So it's getting a second hit of RF and it's going to be dark, okay? When you do these multi-slice, multi-angles, you're going to get that, especially at L5S1 and L45. It's not uncommon. And it's worse when you do T1 weighted. because T1 has a short TR. So that tissue doesn't have a chance to T1 relax. So if they showed you this image in 1224 and they said, what artifact is demonstrated there? And they said to you, cross-excitation, wrap, motion, and chem shift. Cross-excitation is the answer you're going to pick. If they said crosstalk, you're going to give them crosstalk. Again, tell them what they want to hear. Gradient warp is another artifact that comes when you do great big fields of view. I'm sure you guys have seen this one as well. The reason being is because gradients have to have three qualities. They need to be linear, constant, and reproducible. The problem with gradient warp is the frequency in the frequency field of view is getting too big for the gradient to do the to be applied linearly. Linear means straight or no bending and no curving. So when you turn on a gradient, we assume it's perfectly straight over a distance. It's constant, meaning when you turn it on, it stays on and doesn't like falter in strength. And reproducible, every time you turn it on, it comes back on the same strength. So linearity is what happens. You're losing linearity when you do gradient, when you get gradient warp. Okay, so here's a depiction of gradient warp. So you turn on the field gradient, you turn on the frequency field of view, and it's great for the vast majority of it. But at the ends, circled here in purple, what's happening is the gradient just can't do it anymore. You're asking too much of the gradient. And the gradient starts to fall back to zero. So you're losing linearity, and the precessional frequencies in this purple area here is starting to alter. We assume that our gradient, when we turn it on, is this dashed line. That would be perfect. It's infinite, but they're not. They're only good for a certain distance. When you use a big field of view, that's when it's going to happen, like sagittal T-spines, sometimes in the abdomen, long bone studies. Okay, so here's that same image that you just saw. In the middle here is a great big field of view of a great big person. And these are T2 fat sac coronals, or they stir. I don't remember. But anyway, I put that circle there because ideally when we are imaging, we want to keep our field of view within something about the size of an oversized beach ball. You don't want to be imaging way off close to the bore, top of the bore, or the sides. You want to keep it in the middle. So when the field of view is too big, you start to lose linearity on the edges. That's what this artifact is, way out here. Sagittal, this is where you see it very often in your T-spines when you do the counting field of view. You do a great big field of view to count, and you start to lose linearity. The field of view is just too big for what the gradient can do. So this white dashed line is what you want to cover, but it really can't do it. So you lose or warp the field at the ends. When you warp the precessional frequency, when you warp that gradient, the precessional frequencies start to fail and alter, and your image starts to, it looks like something from outer space. Okay, I know you guys are getting tired. We're rounding third, heading for home. Magnetic susceptibility. That is the ability of a material to be magnetized. I went over this a little bit when I started talking about gradient echoes. So top left, the B0 is perfect. Everybody's nice. There's no little waivers. The gradient field is very homogeneous. Okay, the middle, where you see diamagnetic, what's happening is diamagnetic, like water, lightly or very slightly repels the field. Okay, that's fine. But then you've got paramagnetic and ferrous materials that will bring the field into itself. So you've got someone pushing it away and you got somebody pulling it in. When those two guys are right next to each other, you get those little black holes like you saw earlier. Okay, so you've got diamagnetic, paramagnetic, and ferromagnetic. Now, when I say ferromagnetic, I'm not necessarily talking about something that's going to get sucked out of your pocket when you get too close to the magnet. All metals, even aluminum is considered ferromagnetic. It does draw the field into itself a little bit. Okay, so diamagnetic materials intrinsically weakly repel, like water, air, hydrogen, water. Paramagnetic intrinsically weakly attract the field. They bring it in just a little bit. That's our gadolinium. And then ferrous material strongly attract. They bring that magnetic field, those flux lines, into each other. And when you've got differences in susceptibility, so diamagnetic has its own susceptibility, para and ferromagnet have its own susceptibility. So you've got susceptibility differences, and that's when you get those little black holes like we saw in that lady's brain. Okay, the human body has air in the lungs and sinuses. We're mostly water. We've got magnetic susceptibilities all over the place. So you've got opposing forces between dia and paramagnetic. Okay, so that's when you get these little holes. The iron in the blood in this lady's brain is warping the field a little bit. It's differences in susceptibility between the brain and the iron that's in the hemoglobin. That's the top image. Down the bottom, that's a young lady who had a mouth full of braces. And I knew that this, she said, oh, I got braces, real big braces. And, I said, let me see. And I'm looking, I'm going, oh my God, these are going to be terrible. So you can't just say, go away. You got to try it. So I ran the study. We didn't give GAD because they were looking for a pituitary. But anyway, so the braces just completely messed up the field right here. And you can't image that. So there's not a lot you can do except maybe get the braces removed, but that's not our call. So different sequences are going to react to this magnetic susceptibility worse. Okay, these two happen to be gradient echo. This is a gradient echo in the brain. This is just a scout view. These are the worst for seeing the magnetic susceptibility differences because of the sequence. So the way to get around fixing this susceptibility is to do something called a MARS technique. MARS technique is short for metal artifact reduction sequence. And basically, you're going to use a sequence. You're going to widen the receiver bandwidth. That's going to help shorten your minimal TE. And you're going to increase your echo train length, because if a gradient echo is terrible for metal, then because it doesn't have a 180, then a fast spin echo with multiple 180s is going to clean that up. So your basic MARS technique is going to help clean up the metal. So over on that oblique coronal of the shoulder, this person has had a rotator cuff repair, and there's some metal in there. There's not much you can do about it except to try the MARS artifact. Okay, try to stay away from gradient echo and DWIs if you can, and fat sats. That's going to really mess up the fat sat and DWI. So metal is really not much more than a bad susceptibility artifact. Okay, how can you tell the difference between metal and just straight susceptibility? Here's susceptibility in the brain, top right. Get a visual on that. Okay, now you go down a couple. Now that's susceptibility, but that susceptibility is coming from metal. So if they showed you this artifact, would you say it's susceptibility? Yep. Would you say it's metal? I would. Notice the little black halo here and the halo here. That's classic metal artifact, and that's called pileup. Just so you know, when you're scanning and you see this right here, and you've seen it worse times, I'm sure, that's pileup, and that's in the frequency direction, and that comes from metal. So the way to get around that is with the MARS technique. The reason why we don't see good fat sats near metal is because, and these numbers are just for example here, okay, away from the metal, everybody's processing at 63 megahertz. That's great. As you get close to the metal, because the metal brings in, because the metal brings in the magnetic field, it strengthens it. So maybe this tissue here is at 73 megahertz versus this guy that's at 63. And then real close to the metal, 83 megahertz. If you're at a 1.5 Tesla scanner, nothing is processing at 83 megahertz, at least not on purpose. The metal can do that. So this tissue that's really close here is not being resonated by your RF pulse. So metal screws up the magnetic field to a point where you can't image it. The tissue is there, but it's not at the right precessional frequency. So once again, over on the bottom bottom right, here is a classic metal artifact. You can see the pileup in the frequency direction. And this is an AP scout view from a CAT scan of the exact same patient. So here's a little, when he was a little kid, he got shot in the hip or in the pelvis by a BB gun. Corduroy artifact. Now we're getting into artifacts that come from our equipment. Corduroy artifact is just nothing more than bad data points or spikes in your K space. Okay, these spikes are external interfering signals that get placed into K space. So they're bad spikes, and it's going to screw up the entire image. So these bad data points can come from electromagnetic spikes, from gradients, coil not being plugged in well, power supplies are starting to fail. So when you see it, it looks like this. Okay? I did this just the other day, and I said, oh, this is a perfect example of herringbone, and my anterior coil wasn't plugged in well enough. So I scouted them. It was terrible. I went, ooh, okay. And I went and I replugged the coil in, and notice that it's in the entire image. Even though it's worse in the front, it's the entire image that gets affected. I plugged in the coil properly, better. I unplugged it, plugged it back in, and it was fine. So here's some corduroy artifact. Notice that it fills the entire image. It's not just a single band of artifact like it is in the zipper. Okay? RF artifact from bad data points. And anafact. We see this occasionally, usually on the big fields of view. Maybe you guys have seen this before yourself. And it comes from nothing more than having too many coils turned on. So in this particular case, less is more. So over on the far right, there's our field of view on the lumbar spine. And I purposely turned on these extra coils just for the visual, so I could take the picture. So you could get this artifact, anafact, from having an extra coil on that's way outside your field of view. So when you see something like this, there's nothing you can do about it except repeat it and turn off your extra coils. Oversampling also can help. But oversampling does what? It increases time. So be more mindful of what coils you have turned on. Again, more is not always better. Don't just say, I'm going to cover the whole damn thing. No, you can't do that. Okay. So if you guys have any questions, I'll take them now. If you are tired of listening to me talk, thank you, because I'm getting tired of talking, but I am certainly more than happy to answer your questions if you have any. I'm going to stop sharing. And if you guys have any questions, lay them on me.
Great job, Stephen. Awesome.
I'll take that silence with questions as, okay, Powers, you can be quiet now. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, hold on.
Yes,
thank you for your presentation. Oh, okay. I can keep on talking. I have more PowerPoints. You just got to let me get a fresh tea. No, I didn't think so. All right, guys. Well, anyway, thank you very much. Good luck on your registry. And almost all of this material that I covered is all in either or both of my books. And I would very much like to hear from you when you take your registry and how you did. Because Neil and I both care a great deal on how you guys do. We take great pride in what we do, and we only want to try to make this better. So please do the survey and let me know how I did.
Well done. Well done, Stephen. I agree with what Stephen said. You know, we're here to make sure that, you know, you're sitting confidently for the registry. You know, Stephen and I have both been there. It can be quite nerve-wracking and long, number one. So it's all about sort of getting those reps, understanding the full like foundation of the content. And, but yeah, like you said, I have them scheduled to come out at 3:30. So everyone should have an email. In the email, like I said, is a 20-question practice quiz. You can take 3 attempts. We have the certificate in there as well. And then, of course, that survey. The survey is important to us. I know, listen, we've all been to like restaurants and stuff. It's like, oh, do our survey. Yeah, if you could please do our survey. Now I feel like, now I know what they feel like, because it kind of tells us how, we do. So it's just important, especially when it's sort of a small sample size. I think we're going to probably move this to like quarterly sessions, and then, kind of roll it out. It's, I guess it's fair to say that this is a pilot, and I think that we've had some really amazing results. Our last class that was in our last registry review, they all passed. And I think that, yes, the post program is great, but being able to tie it in with what Professor Powers brings to the table after clinical, I think is vital. So we appreciate you all coming and staying attentive and the questions. And more importantly, thank you so much, Professor Powers, because we know it's a gauntlet, and I'm sure that maybe that tea will have a little bit of extra in it tonight.
I just have one more thing, one more word of advice. Okay, you guys need to practice answering questions. So if you don't have registry review books that are questions, get a couple and practice answering the questions, and then grade it and say, oh, you know something, I'm okay with fast spin echo and DWI, but I don't get gradient echoes. Okay, go back and study gradient echoes. Work on your weaknesses, not your strength. But basically practice answering questions. Don't not answer questions and say, I know stuff, and go in for your registry, because you're going to be unpleasantly surprised. Practice, practice, practice. And with that, I will stop talking. Thank you very much for your time, guys.
You got it. And, for those that are Pulse students, you have the mock registry. That's 220 questions right there. And you get 3 attempts to take that as well. So we use it as a red light, green light sort of mentality, where if you take it, we see that it's a plus to minus 5% passing rate. So let's just say you score an 85, you should score somewhere between an 80 and a 90. But if you take it and you're in the 70s, let's just say you're at 71 or a 70, you're going to likely fall 65 to 75, which is a little risky. So for those Pulse students, feel free to take that mock registry. I think it's very important. And then, of course, any other questions you want to any other materials, go for it. But that's included, so you don't have to really purchase anything. So just a reminder there. All right. Professor Powers, thank you so much. And, I guess maybe we'll chat a little later, and, maybe send that video over, and I'll get it going.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Peace.
Bye.